This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Covel. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. I want to wish you a Merry Christmas for 2023. This is my last recorded episode before Christmas. I'll have one more interview coming out before Christmas, but this is my last fresh me. And I'm going to reach in today and I'm going to play 3 of my favorite episodes that have ever appeared on this podcast. 3 interviews with 3 brilliant guys. 1 a trader, 1 an academic, and 1 a businessman. But if you can't find wisdom in the words of these guys, man, just turn it off and go keep watching this film Oppenheimer on repeat. Now, I want to try to stay happy today. I've already just wished everyone a Merry Christmas. But I got to tell you, even when you want to stay happy, you've got to wade through everything. I just tried to watch Oppenheimer the other day. I stopped with 20 minutes left. The messaging, the propaganda, the image rehab, the history revisionism, nonstop. How does Christopher Nolan go from The Dark Knight and Interstellar to this? This is not movie making. I mean, it looks pretty, but it's just propaganda. It's not real. And that's why I love finding the guests that I find on this podcast, because I want to find something real. You know, in the trend following world, the real is the price data. You can't lie about the price data. I mean, you can try to lie about it, but then everyone will see that it's a lie. However, in the land of Hollywood movies, you can say whatever the fuck you want to say, and at least 50% of the population will believe it. They'll lap it up like a good little dog. It's quite gross that you can reach a position of power, and instead of being fair, you just put out something like Oppenheimer. But I do want to keep this at a Merry Christmas note, even though, let's be honest, you say the Merry Christmas and you still got to deal with the world around us. That's the way it is. But even in the middle of that crazy world, so to speak, that crazy world that surrounds us that we can't predict, we can't know what's going to happen, we can't solve it, we can't really change it that much. We can change our actions. That's what we can do. We can change our actions. We can change our actions towards others. And that's a positive thing. That's worth having a Merry Christmas for. Without any further delay, well, a little bit of delay. Now look, many of you have listened to this podcast for a long time. You will recognize the 3 episodes that are about to play. But many of you have not listened to this podcast or have not heard all episodes. And these 3 are 3 of my most favorite, most inspirational episodes. And they include Ed Seykota, Anders Ericsson, and Robert Rosenberg. Without any further delay from me, I hope you enjoy. And again, please have a Merry, Merry Christmas. My guest today is Ed Seykota. Ed is affectionately titled by me a living legend. And even if no one else knew who Ed was, I would call him that. Not from any kind of a hero worship standpoint or anything like that. But early on in my career, Ed influenced me. He got me thinking clearly. If you ever see me picking apart arguments, starting debates, And perhaps you fixate on the emotional component of the debate and you don't look at the facts and you don't look at the logic. That's what I learned from Ed. Put aside the emotion. Let people get all hot and bothered. Let them get all worked up. And then calmly, coolly break everything into its component parts and try and move things along a process that gets to a good answer. Maybe there's not a perfect answer, but let's move things along to a good answer. Let's think clearly about our words and our actions. I'm forever grateful that Ed Seykota influenced me in that fashion. I hope you enjoyed this conversation. I was trying to think of an example just as we were getting on the call here, and I was thinking, and I'm not trying to pick on a particular bank or anything necessarily, but a few years ago, I read something that JP Morgan had made money every day in the first quarter of the year. And I was thinking, wow, is that a great example of the Gavopoly system in action? Would be one question to you. The second part of that question, though, would be, is that if there doesn't seem to be much outrage right now, and I'm wondering if the outrage, the lack of outrage, is reflected in the fact that so many average everyday people via mutual funds and perhaps pensions actually have investments in these many Gavopoly type companies. It just seems like it's a precarious situation.
Yeah, I don't want to comment on any particular banks, and I'm not sure exactly in what section you're talking about. But it's everywhere you look, everywhere there's a regulation, and there's a Gavopoly system at work, and the outrage, as you say, the outrage doesn't really occur because as the system grows, more and more people have an investment in it, and as you stop competition within a economy, the whole economy itself becomes less competitive. And we're certainly seeing that show up in our relationships with other countries, where particularly China and other countries, India and so forth. We're not competitive. The whole economy, our economy is not competitive because we don't allow ourselves to compete with one another anymore. And so we're not competitive with other countries.
I think to add to that point on the other countries, I see it being in Asia right now. It seems like that in Asia, you can build an 80-story office tower faster than sometimes perhaps you can install a fence in America.
Yeah, that's right. Trying to do anything in the United States requires an enormous amount of regulatory effort, and companies have to maintain whole staffs just to comply with regulations, and all of that has got to get paid for somewhere. So they've got to eventually get to raise prices, and we're not competitive. So it's and I'm not saying any of this is bad or wrong or should be changed. In my book, I don't say that there's anything wrong. I'm just looking at how does the engine work. How does this work, and how do we explain what we've got? And I'm not trying to change anything. I'm just saying, well, this is how it works, and I need to know how it works because, as your audience does, and so do I, we try to trade, and we want to understand as best we can what's going on. So my point is not to change anything. I'm not a politician, and I'm not running for office or anything. I'm not promising any changes, or I don't have any formula for change. I'm saying this is what's happening, and you might as well take this into your personal calculus when you're playing the markets.
Well, you make a great point because you're talking to a guy that unfortunately grew up in the Washington, D.C. area, so I had to listen to too much politics. And I think there's a great video on the internet with Ray Dalio talking about the economic machine. And I think you're doing something similar, but it's your take, your research, and you're saying, hey, look, this is the machine that I see. This is the economy as I see it. And I'm not trying to give you a value judgment on it, but by all known facts and my research, the evidence lays out, this is what's happening.
Yeah, and Dalio has a wonderful video out there, and he's talking about how the economy works. Basically, his analysis supposition he has, we have a free economy, and those kinds of things work in a free economy. But since 1913, when we had the Fed, you'll see the free economy isn't really free to function anymore. And if you look at long-term charts up till 1913, before 1913, when we had the Fed, we had a fairly stable economy. We had blips, ups and downs, and so forth. But since the Fed's come along, it's enabled the Gavopoly system to put an effective tax rate on citizens and spend money in excess of what they can tax. There used to be a limit to government growth in the Gavopoly system. That limit was that they would have to tax people in order to fund the government. But they don't have to do that anymore. They can go to the Fed and they can get however the mechanism works, however you want to explain the mechanism. You can say they can print up money or get a line of credit or whatever. Basically, they can spend money before they tax. I've shown in my model, if you keep government spending to under about 1.5% effective asset tax, so under 1.5%, government never can grow big enough to stop the growth of the free competition sector. But once you get an effective tax rate above that, then the government will grow, and it's a parasite. It's the same mathematics of a parasite, where the parasite will grow and then finally it will take over the host, or like a cancer or a parasite. The mathematics and the dynamics are the same. It stays in balance if you keep the asset tax rate under about 1.5%, but we're way over that now, and we are seeing a decline in manufacturing and in tool making, and we're consuming, or the Gavopoly system is now consuming the free competition sector. And when we run out of a free competition sector, which is imminent in my opinion, then we have a whole different economy where you have the Gavopoly system trying to manage the free competition sector, and it can't do that. It doesn't know how to do that. It's not set up to do that. It's set up to take and exploit. It's not set up to create and innovate. And so we're headed towards an economy in which we have basically a controlled economy, less freedom. I'm not suggesting this is going to change. I'm suggesting you've got to start admitting that's what's happening, and you got to cope with it. You have to cope with it in your decision making, and there are ways to cope with it. Wishing it'll come back and thinking you can vote for somebody that's going to turn it around, I think, is wishful thinking.
Let me take a step back, Ed. I want to kind of take a step back for a second, let you talk a little bit about some historical perspectives, your own in particular. And one of the things that I've always loved about you, and we're going to get back on the Gavopoly conversation and kind of take it to its natural ending and some of the solutions that you see, since if we're being faced with this Gavopoly situation, you do see some clear solutions, or at least some directions that people can go. There's no perfection for sure, but I think one of the things
I don't think there's a solution for the economy. I don't think there's a problem. This is just what it does. I think there are some things that people can do as individuals to cope with it as it evolves and changes, but I'm certainly not suggesting a change in the economy. I think this is just what it does. There's nothing to fix. This is what it does. Just like people, they get born, they grow, they mature, and then they die. That's the way it happens. And so you just have to learn to cope with things.
Well, you just made my point for where I wanted to go, which is, and correcting me on language. One of the things that I've always learned from you and admired from you is the clear thinking. And I always, when I try to respond to people, if I'm doing an interview or something in an online forum, I try to stay clear. I try to be as objective as I can. You are exceptionally good at this, and especially when people look at your writings, they can see it's very, very clear. How did you start to have this type of clear thinking as an individual, or was this something that you felt always as a young man and it's been with you your whole life? How did you develop this way to look at the world clearly?
Well, thank you. It's a struggle for me. I'm thinking about it a lot, and I always think, wow, I could have said that. I could have said that better. I'll probably hear this interview and I'll say, oh man, that's pretty lame. I do a lot of rewriting. writing and rewriting, and I've always done that. And I try to think about something until it gets simple. And if it's complicated, I figure, well, I don't understand it yet. So one of the things I do is I just think about things till they get simple. And then they're easy to explain, and then they're pretty clear. And I've had some mentors in my life that have been sticklers. Jay Forrester, for one, absolutely unforgiving about any misuse of English or any equations. They ought to be annotated, and the units of measure had to match, and you just couldn't get away with anything. And so I developed that. I just developed that habit. I've developed this to such an extent that I have a language that goes with it, SVOP, which subject, verb, object, keep it in the present tense. That's a way that helps sort it out. If I find myself straying from that grammatical convention, I figure I don't understand something. Anything that's clear fits into that linguistic format. So I'm on this, and I enjoy it. It's just I probably take it to extreme. It's not. It's not a good strategy socially. Socially, people are very metaphoric, and they're very inaccurate, and they just say what they feel, and you've got to decipher their feelings and so forth. So I don't recommend this as a social method, but as far as thinking and trying to get logical answers, it's pretty good.
I was wondering maybe if you would go a little bit further on Jay Forrester. And for those that don't know, very well-known MIT professor, systems dynamics. And I think Jay is still with us. He's like 96, I think. Yeah. Yeah.
And prior to publishing my book, I went and visited with him, and I included him, some things on him in the book. Amazing person. He, at one point, held a patent on the core memory for computers, enabling some of the first of the world in computer. He was behind that. He was inventor of the radar positioning system, which was a servo control mechanism. And then he went on and applied servo control thinking to business situations and developed a modeling language, invented the whole field of system dynamics. To really understand how systems work, I think requires a lot of training. I think it's imperative to have some kind of an engineering background, preferably electrical engineering, preferably servo dynamics, to understand how systems work. So there's a whole field, and he pioneered it, and this is an amazing guy.
I was actually, I'm working on a project right now, and I was reading a couple of his white papers recently, and it's, I can see how he influenced you on the clear thinking, because his white papers are just crystal clear. It's fun to read them because it's just there's no beating around the bush. It's all just direct. And it's understandable too. It's not an academic treatise. It's something that you can sit down and start to digest.
He would go to conferences on economics, and there would be a panel, and then they would have comments, and he would point out that a certain speaker in his speech had contradicted himself several times. And he would listen. He would really listen to what people say, and he would think about it. And then if it wasn't accurate, he wasn't shy about saying so.
No, like I said, I think for the audience out there not familiar, checking out your Trading Tribe website at edsakota.com, they could definitely get an understanding of, if they're not familiar with what you and I are talking about right now, they will definitely start to understand how you handle your FAQs, your frequently asked questions. But that's a completely different subject. Let me
go ahead. On the topic of getting things exactly right, I want to point out that's Sakota.com, not edsakota.com, SEYKOTA.com. Edsakota goes somewhere else. Yeah, and so do I, but the website is Sakota.com.
Ed, let me get back into the notion of Gavopoly for a second. So we've got this system that's operating, and as you kind of say, it's doing as it should. You are observing and you're describing it, but it's not a pretty conclusion to when the 39th day and the duckweed races across the pond. It's not a pretty conclusion, but I think what's tough when you look at the media and the political systems, everybody has a fix. If you vote for me, I can fix it. I've got this platform. The media says if we do this, we can fix it. If we watch this TV show, if we get upset about this issue, and I'm just as guilty as some people to get upset about things, but it's all seems to be one big dog and pony show. But if we get back to your modeling of the Gavopoly system, the dog and pony show just distracts us, but the system marches on.
Well, the dog and pony show is part of the system. The dog and pony show is purposefully orchestrated to distract people from the real issues. Nobody talks about the real engine behind this is the growth of the Gavopoly system and the fact that it has unlimited access to money. In my model, I've even tried to, even if you eliminate borrowing for the government and you reduce regulations, at this point it would take 20 or 30 years of austerity to get any meaningful change to get us back to a free competition society. You're not going to get anybody elected on a 30-year austerity program in which the government decides that they're not going to borrow money anymore. And that's just not going to happen. So nobody's even talking about this, or nobody's even interested in it. The real issue about how the economy works and how debt works and how deficit spending works and bailouts and all the rest of that, those are just kind of accepted, and no one is concerned about it. What they're concerned about is there's a race riot, or there's police, or someone thinks the police are being too brutal, or one race group is beating up on another race group, or there's people coming across the border or not coming across the border. So we're talking about fixing things that are all symptoms, but nobody. There's a couple politicians. I don't care to name any of them, but there's a couple of them that try to talk about the real issues. They always get marginalized, and they don't even make the final cut in the political race. And what you have is the distinction between political parties is fairly obscure at this point. They're all voting for expansion of the Gavopoly system. They want to make this. The system is now in its final phases where it's taking over. There's no way to resist it. There's no way to stop it. I don't recommend spending a lot of time worrying about it. It's like a patient, or if you had a friend that was dying of terminal cancer, well, what do? You try to make the best of the time you have, but you don't spend a lot of time trying to fix it. There's nothing to fix. Or someone is just dying. There's nothing to fix. We're making a transition, or a caterpillar turns into a butterfly and is a change in form. There's nothing to fix. It's how it works. You don't have to use death metaphors, just a transformation metaphor. The economy is transforming from what used to be a free competition, innovative society. It's now transforming into a very controlled society. This is a transition. It's natural. It happens time and time again to all societies. There's a cycle. It goes back and forth, and there's the Gavopoly system grows until it finally renders the host society inoperable, and then it collapses, and then it starts over again. This is a long-term cycle. You don't find any currencies around that are more than a couple hundred years old. And if you had invested one penny at the birth of Christ, at year zero, or whatever year you want to make the difference between BC and AD, back then, that one penny growing at nominal interest rates of a couple percent would be more than all the money in the world. So you say, well, how can that be? Because there certainly was a penny, and there certainly was ways to invest, and how come nobody has done that? Well, because you earn a lot of money, and then you get these periodic resets in the money. So nobody's able to accumulate money for very long, because the money eventually goes worthless. And that's also part of the design. And you have hard money for a while. You have gold or sticks or some other tokens of exchange, cattle or whatever you have. And then you go off into currency, and then you get bankers decide they can loan out money because not everybody's going to come and get the money at the same time. And then you get fractional reserve banking, and then you get a federal or a central bank, and then you get excesses, and you get huge bubbles, like having bubbles much more frequent and much larger bubbles now. And eventually the bubbles are just going to dominate, and every bubble becomes more severe than the last one.
Ed, I think for some people listening, I could see some in the audience already building up a criticism in their mind. And I think what people need to understand is that you're not, some people might be thinking, oh, Ed Seykota, he sounds bearish, or he sounds like a doom and gloomer. Whereas you are taking a very distinct perspective to where, like, look, I'm observing the system as it is. You're very clear about it. You're saying, you can't really worry about it. You can't stop it. And I think, and you're not trying to make a prediction of the timing of something. You're just objectively trying to analyze the economy that we all are in the middle of.
Yeah, I'm not saying anything wrong with it. I think this is the way it works. And that's basically what we do in the trading tribe, is we look at, how can we be more effective as people in coping with the environment? If you'd been around 100 years ago, or maybe back in the early 1800s, a whole different economy. You want to get out there and build machines, start factories, and hire people and participate in the greatest economic miracle ever. These days it's different. It's a different, and there certainly are pockets of innovation. There are very bright people coming up with whole new industries. You got drones flying around that we didn't have before, and lots of advances. So there certainly are people innovating, but by and large, a lot of people are out of work, and you have a huge dependent class, and you have a huge amount of moral hazard in the economic system, and you have a disconnect between our governance and people. People don't even believe what the politicians are telling them anymore. So you have a whole different economy and a whole different society, and it's just part of the evolution. And you can find all kinds of books about what we ought to do to fix things. I don't think there's anything to fix. I think it's just how it works. And there's always people that think we should fix things. It's one of the symptoms of this transition we're going through, is there's people that want to, go out there in the fall and pick up the leaves and glue them back on the trees because they liked it better in the spring when the leaves were green and on the trees. But you can't glue the leaves back on the trees. You just have to accept the fall for the beauty that's there and move with it. So that's what we do in the trading tribe, is we try to, what can we do with our own attitudes and our own responses to cope with whatever the flow is, not try to change things, pretend they're different. What can we do to go with the flow? In other words, to use trend following in our own personal lives.
I know you look at trend following from not only from a trading perspective, but your own life perspective.
Yeah, and I think if you're going to really be a trend follower, you're going to have a lot of trouble limiting it to one area, because let's say you have a trend following system. You say, well, okay, I'm gonna have a diversified portfolio, a trend following portfolio. So I'm going to free myself up from emotions. Emotions have always been the big problem here. So I'm going to have a diversified trend following portfolio, or I'm going to invest in somebody else's portfolio, and that's going to fix this emotional problem. And then what happens? Well, their investment or their portfolio goes up and down. And then I get emotional problems with that. So you don't really fix your emotions by having a system. What you do is you just move them upstream. You move them upstream instead of, you have constituents within the portfolio that used to bother you and they went up and down. And then now you have a portfolio that goes up and down. You just move the problem upstream. So ultimately you have to say, well, what is it that I'm feeling, and what do I do when I feel these things, and can I come up with better and more useful or productive ways of responding when the thing goes up and down. And eventually, you've got to come to terms with that. And so the best trend followers, I think, are the ones that have made peace with themselves and have said, well, this is what I do in the case of things going up and down, the value increasing and decreasing. This is how I behave, and this is how I act. And of course, as you know, there are all kinds of things you can do when things go up. Some people, when something goes up, they sell them. Some people, when things go up, they buy. And when they keep going up, some people sell more and some people buy more. And if you go to extreme in either of those cases, you're counterproductive, self-destructive. You've got to know how to do that, and you've got to do it consistently. You've got to do it in your personal life. I think if you do these things in your personal life as well, it supports a trend following. Because if you're not in alignment between your overall philosophy and how you behave as a person, and you try to do trend following, well, there's going to be conflicts. And so we in Trading Tribe, we hardly ever talk about actual trading or what the markets are doing. What we're working with is the emotional reaction to volatility, or emotional reaction to loss, or to structure or authority, or all these other issues. People straighten these things out. Their relationships with their significant others and their children get better. They report more satisfaction in all areas of life. And incidentally, their trading is getting better, and they don't quite know how that happened, but it's just they've turned into a person that now can cope with uncertainty and can cope with volatility, and they couldn't do it before. And you can't, in my opinion, you can't take a system and use that to medicate your feelings. You've got to get your feelings. And some people say, well, I'm just going to suppress my feelings, a stiff upper lip approach, or grin and bear it, or clench your teeth and hope for the best. I tend to go the other way. You try to say, what's the positive intention of these feelings? Celebrate them, find out the positive intention, and as soon as you do that, the feeling disappears and you go on to the next feeling. So I'm more of the go with the flow on the feelings as well. So there's a lot of different approaches. But by now, after we've been doing this a couple decades, we're developing a body of knowledge of how to do this, and to what extent can we actually reprogram response patterns. We're getting pretty good at this. As we've got, and you can follow what we're doing. I put it all on the blog at Trading Tribe, at tradingtribe.com. All this is free if people want to go on there and look at it. And we're documenting the growth of all kinds of people who are using this technology, and it seems to be, to the extent they use it, it seems to be working pretty well for them.
It always just seems like to me that the place that one is trying to find is just some peace and contentment, and there's this just, again, I start off with giving you the praise of the clear thinking. I think that's to just be able to sit in a room and not feel, I mean, you're not to have this anxiety and worrying constantly. And if one has that, to work on that. And I think it's just trying to find it. I see a lot of parallels to your work and some of the meditation. I read some of the Zen scholars like Alan Watts. It seems like there's some commonalities with some of your work and the Eastern thought process.
I believe every feeling has a positive intention. For instance, if you're in a house and you smell smoke, you hear crackling sounds, and notice the temperature going up in the room, and you conclude that maybe the house is on fire. That would be a really good time to feel anxiety and to take some action in response to it. So I'm not so sure that you want to, medicate your mind, anesthetize yourself, and put yourself into some meditative state where you don't respond. That's not really what I'm saying. I think you want to notice the feeling you're having in the moment and act appropriately. And you want to learn the difference between medicating a feeling and responding to it proactively. So it's not always, I'm not suggesting you always aim towards peacefulness. Sometimes you want to get busy. you might want to get busy and put a trade on, or you might want to get busy and take some corrective action, some risk control, or you might want to take some action and get into some opportunity. But whatever it is, I think you can learn to come into harmony with your feelings. And to some extent, it's nice to just be able to be peaceful and watch your feelings and watch your mind and rest. It's important to rest particularly when you feel tired. But I don't recommend using either trading tribe technology, which I call TTP, trading tribe process, using that or anything else for medicinal purposes, like a drug or alcohol or a sedative. You have to watch out. There's a difference between using any of these technologies as a sedative, and I don't think any of the Zen masters really recommend blissing out and staying there permanently. I think they want to be responsive and proactive to whatever feeling arises in the moment.
I love the constant learning. What's the better way to handle expressing oneself? What's the better way there's always a better way to do it, right?
Well, I think so. I think I try. We're here in the moment, and I'm learning something. I'm learning something from you, and I'm trying to be responsive. And I'll think about this later, and I'll say, "Oh man, and now I really could have said that better." But that's how life is. I do the best I can in the moment, and then go back and maybe do it differently next time, and try to learn. And study my responses and say, well, can I change the response? And then that's what we do in a trading tribe. We try to look at what our responses are to our feelings, and then we practice identifying, well, what is it we are doing? How are we getting the result we're getting? And can we change our response patterns and get different results next time around?
The only way you can learn is to extend yourself to perhaps in front of somebody that has more experience. And once you extend yourself, there's the chance that you might be forced to learn something that makes you feel like, wow, why did I just say it that way? I could have said it the way he just told me. But you want to get to the point of knowing the better way until you extend yourself with the wrong way.
Yeah, we find in the right environment, and we take a lot of care to set up the environment correctly. Once you set up an environment in which the goal is for people to help each other improve, I think this is true in the trading tribe, and some companies have this down pretty well too. Some other organizations where when personal growth becomes important, then when people correct you or offer advice, you say, thank you. Thank you for helping me learn something. In a lot of situations, somebody will correct you or give you advice, and then you get upset about it, and you may say something to protect yourself, or put them down, or swear at them, or tell them to keep their distance, or whatever. So it's a different environment where everyone is trying to grow and do a better job. And that's another thing we had. When you have an expansive economy and a company that's growing and everybody's trying to do better, then the culture in that company, when you have growth, when you have a free competition society and free competition, you have a competitive startup firm, and somebody says to somebody else, there's a better way to do this, then they say, thank you for telling me. And they start doing it that way. When you get a survival company, one that's overly restrictive and political, and there's regulations, you better mind your own business and don't go talking to somebody else about what they should be doing. You see the whole environment, the whole structure. The environment in one case is pro-personal growth and pro-learning, and the other one is not. It's very territorial and very defensive. You can walk into companies, you can sense this right away. Some are open to grow, and then they get mature, and then if they start getting kind of the Gavopoly model, and they start going the other way, and they don't want to have, you offer advice at your own risk.
Ed, one of the things that you do in the Gavopoly book and your premise is you talk about the strategy of trend following. And I don't want to phrase it as a solution, but you offer trend following as a way to perhaps, a better phrasing is to cope with as we move towards this oligopoly system that you see as inevitable. And trend following is, and perhaps there's other solutions, and I'd love to hear if you think there are. But as you talk about trend following as one kind of a way to cope, I would love for you to go back in time a little bit, if you will, and because you've had an interesting career, you've had some interesting mentors, interesting students. But I know, and I mentioned this in my email, there's a couple traders in your early years that I think had a really strong influence on you. And I would love for you to share a little bit of wisdom or perhaps experience or thoughts or memories about two gentlemen in particular, if you wouldn't mind. And that'd be Amos Hofstadter and Richard Donchian. And Amos Hofstadter, he was at Commodities Corporation, and Richard Donchian at Hayden Stone, just two very accomplished early pioneers in the field of trend following. Would you share some wisdom?
I'll be glad to share what I know. I knew Donchian a lot better than Hofstadter, and Donchian had noticed this system. He noticed the 2-week rule in copper. 2-week rule meaning you buy something when it makes highs for 2 weeks, and you sell it when it makes lows for 2 weeks. And he just noticed this somehow, and he didn't remember exactly how he noticed it. I asked him once, how'd you come up with a 2-week rule? And he said, I don't exactly know, and you're the first person that's ever asked. He said he just kind of came up with it, as far as I can remember. And that was the start of the start of automated trend following was when he came up to the 2-week rule. And before that, you can look at some of Livermore's writings, and he had a system of pivot points and so forth. And there's other people that have talked about it. He basically started the 2-week rule. Now that won't work today. Back then you had a little different character of the markets. And the 2-week rule used to work in copper. And then we found that you had to lengthen those, and maybe you make the weeks longer, 6 weeks, or sometimes now they've got 30 or 40, 50 weeks, or much more than that. He had this system, and then he had a couple followers there in his office. He came up with a system. He didn't always follow it himself, but he had this system, and he had people on it, and he had people that were religiously following the system, and they seemed to do pretty well. And I came along, and I studied his rule set. He had Donchian's rules and Donchian's guidelines. And about that time, we had computers were starting to become within reach of people to use them. Although they didn't have personal computers, they did have mainframes at some companies. And I got, if you can believe this, I got to go into the major brokerage house at the time on the weekend, and I had access to their mainframe computers that they used to run the company. And I was in there, and there was a security guard, and there was me, and I had access to the complete computer base of the whole company. And I was just using it to do computer testing.
Were you pinching yourself at that time?
No, I thought it was just normal. I said, well, I want to do this research, and they said, okay. And in those days, nobody ever thought about anybody trying to go in there and do anything nefarious. I was just in there doing research. No one in those days, you wouldn't even think about something like that. But these days, you couldn't get anywhere close to the inner workings of a brokerage house. These days, you couldn't do it. But in those days, I did the computer testing on the mainframe computer of the brokerage house, and all of their discs and all their history and everything. They were just sitting around in this big room. It was a huge room, and all these mainframe computers and these big tape drives and so forth. It was just, now you can get probably all the computational power in that whole room. Probably you got more computational power in your cell phone now. In those days, that was quite the thing. So I would run back tests, and I would do a back test that you could do now in probably a second or two. It would take half hour, 45 minutes to do one set of tests. And I was using punch cards, and it was a different era back then. Did you find it unusual, or what were your feelings at the time? Because there weren't a huge number of peers that you could bounce ideas off. I mean, you said you knew Dick Donchian, but there wasn't this
I mean, today there's a much wider network and people are connected on the internet. They can reach out to you at FAQs, but there was no FAQs for you back then.
No, and I took Donchin's work, and he had a letter that he would publish every week. He would publish a letter which would have his rules on it, and it would also have a kind of a model account, and you could follow along. And the idea was you would follow along and you would place your orders with him. I guess that was the way that was supposed to work. So I tested his rules, and I came back and said, well, the rules they're internally are not consistent. The rules you can't program all these rules at the same time because they conflict with each other. So I started taking rule sets that were non-conflicting, and I tried to tune it up and see, well, here's what we can do. And I would try different experiments with the rules, and I would check it with some brokers and traders in the office. And a lot of times I say, well, I'm going to change this. I'm going to make the system less responsive. So the market has to go up more before you start to buy it. So I'll make the time constants longer. And people would say, well, that's going to make it more risky because your stop's going to be further away. And then we would test it and we would get the exact opposite result. So all these things were very counterintuitive. I did some of the first testing, and you're right, there wasn't any other standard. Now I've got this on my website. If you or your listeners want to go on the website and replicate some of these tests to learn how to do it, I've got it on there, and there's a template, and you can do it on your Excel spreadsheet or whatever. And then enough people have done it so they all get the same result to the penny. So I'm pretty confident I've got the right answer up there. But in those days, no, there wasn't anybody else. I was just curious, and I said, well, how does this work? And Donchin had set it up as a system. I said, well, okay, I'm going to simulate it. I'll go back in the computer and see if I get the same results that Donchin's getting, and I'll try to set up a diversified portfolio. And we did that, and the company I was with marketed it for a while, and we had a diversified portfolio, and it was all run on computer by a service bureau. I had a service bureau. And we would enter the data every day and then get the result, and then we would put the orders in. But the company couldn't stick to it. The company I was with couldn't stick to it. And they also couldn't resist the temptation of trying to get the customers to trade more often than the system wanted them to trade. Because the problem with the system was it worked, and it made money for the clients, but the problem was it made far less money for the brokerage house because they were used to day traders, and they were used to people coming in and lasting a few months and then losing their money and moving on and doing something else. And so that's the way the brokerage house set up. People would come in and try to trade, lose their money, and leave. And here was something else. They would come in, and they didn't believe they were going to stay, and they said, well, commissions are like a tenth of what they used to be. They're staying with positions. And this is going to wreck our business model. And so there was all kinds of pressures to get people to trade more often, and then there was all kinds of pressures, like you pointed out in some of your letters to me. There was they've got fancy names for it now, like disposition effect. But in those days, people just didn't want to hold on to something. It went up a little bit, and they want to take their profit. Went down a little bit, and they wanted to add more and hope it would go back up. And so you had lots of pressures against following systems in those days. So I had invented something that no one really wanted. And so then I left, and I went out on my own, found clients, and I found that some of the most important things was developing a relationship with the clients, that they really knew what to expect and they knew what was going on. Because if the client was not aligned to it, and if you didn't have emotional rapport and understand that the system is more than the mathematics. The system is the mathematics plus the willingness to follow the system. And when you increase your worldview to include the investor himself and his emotional responses to what's going on, when you finally get the system include everything, you can design a system that works. But just going into a computer and tuning up your software and saying, well, here's the right set of parameters. Well, great. You've got something that theoretically will work for some theoretical robot that'll follow it. But there aren't a whole lot of robots that got money these days. Maybe someday, but right now you've got human beings with human feelings. And unless you include that into your system design, the thing's going to, the wheels are going to come off the cart around the corner.
Yeah, I think you really sum up so much of your ethos in those last few sentences for those that are paying attention. I'm curious, Ed, too. I want just a couple more questions. I won't keep you. But as you talk about, we're talking today about your research into developing this Gavopoli model. You're talking about your early research with trend following models. It seems like, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like you've been highly motivated by the puzzle aspect of just figuring things out.
Yeah, I guess I like puzzles. I've got a huge collection of what you might call barroom puzzles, or these metal detanglement puzzles where you have metal pieces that fit together and you got to figure out how to get them apart and together. I've got a huge collection of those, and I in the morning I do chess puzzles, and I like figuring things out. It's always been something that I enjoy doing. I don't know exactly where that comes from. I think it's been I've been able to incorporate that in my life in such a way that it's useful. But yeah, I think that the puzzle aspect of what I did in the markets, or what I did with the Gavopoli book, what's driven me is I want to understand how it works. I want to know how it works. Then it works and it makes money. That's great. I mean, it's nice to make money, but I think I wouldn't have done it in the first place. Maybe figured out some other way of making money. But the puzzle was what got me. I said, I got to figure this out. Why does this guy Donchin has got this thing that's mechanical, it's making money? How can that be? How can you get something that's mechanical that can make money for nothing without doing any work? How can that be? And so, I kind of got attracted to looking at it, but I don't think I would have gone into it. I wouldn't have gone into it for just the money. It was the puzzle. It was how does this work? I mean, how does this actually work? Can I build a model and can I understand this? And then when you understand it, then it becomes interesting to explain it to people for a while, or then you put it on the website, or you write a book and you go on and you look for a new puzzle. So
I mean, when you were back in the day though, and you're in those mainframe rooms and you're by yourself and you're struggling. I mean, there's got to be a struggle, of course, to try and figure this all out. I mean, was it just pure excitement at the time, and this internal excitement that was driving you to just keep going and going till you got the puzzle solved?
Well, that's a good question. That's one of the best questions I've ever heard. What motivates somebody who's a researcher? What motivates them to go? I don't. You say, well, is it the pleasure of the puzzle, or is it the discomfort and not knowing? I think it's deeper than that. It's just that's what I do. That's what I do. I do that, and I play banjo, and I get lost in it. Mm. That's my meditation. I have to do it. If I can't play music, something dies. And same with solving puzzles. That's who I am, and that's what I do. And I don't think of it as there's something that pushes me to do it. That's just who I am, and that's what I have to do.
Yeah. I still feel like I'm in training wheels, but I sometimes feel like my career is the same way. I don't necessarily know why. I'm just driven to do what I do, and I'm not necessarily sure what I even do, but I just do it.
Yeah, I like that, and you're good at it, and you're that's one of the places I think we succeed in the tribe, when we get people to this place you're at, where you find out who you are and what you do, and you just do it, and you express yourself, and you create a value by expressing exactly who you are, not pretending to be somebody else. That's a very high state. Congratulations for being there. It'd be a different world if everybody could get there, and would hope people would follow in your footsteps. And I've watched your career over many years, and I've seen you keep expanding and getting closer to who you are. And now you're really blooming, and you're really making a big contribution. So, good job.
Well, I tell you though, for those that don't know, I'm not going to tell the exact story, but you influenced me greatly when I met you for the first time in 2001. And I can still remember some of the things that you said to me. And I think for some people, they might have felt threatened. And I don't think I felt threatened. I probably was like, okay, what has he just said to me? Why is he saying it? What's the deeper meaning? So in many ways, as you talk about your love of puzzles, I felt like you were giving me a puzzle. Michael, you might want to consider this. Ba, 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 ba. And so then, of course, I just considered that. And you didn't give specific instructions. You gave some big picture insights. And I think that's probably how you like to be. I think you just want to see if there's more puzzle finders out there.
Yeah, and like, you're open. You wanted to do something. You wanted to go somewhere. You were like on a growth path, and then you viewed ideas from me and other people, and you've surrounded yourself with an amazing group of people who have amazing amount of ability and knowledge and wisdom and resources. You've surrounded yourself with one of the most advanced group of mentors I think is possible. You just like to do that. So I think you had an attraction. You attracted people like that, and you enjoyed hearing what they have to say. The people that are on your podcast, people in your life, all are people with strong opinions, all people that make you think and make you grow. And you just have some kind of a affinity for people like that, and that's part of what makes you good at what you do.
Well, if they keep talking to me, I should keep talking to them. That seems like a good rule. If really smart people will agree to talk to me, I should probably talk to them, because then I wouldn't be that smart.
Well, I mean, it seems to be working. It seems to be working.
Well, listen, hey, you are. I've kept you for too long. Hopefully, you will get on and have some conversations more regularly. I think I think you could appreciate. I'm sure you feel this, that the flow of our conversation, because we haven't really caught up on the phone for a long time. You can feel the flow improve as the conversation goes on, which is fun. So
yeah. It takes a while to get into it, and then it takes a while to turn it off again. So
it's time to turn it off now. So hey, listen, Ed, I appreciate you taking the time. Everybody can make it to Seykota.com, SEYKOTA.com, correct?
That's right. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you for making me think, and I enjoy listening to you and talking to you. You always make me think, and I appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Ed. You always make me think as well. Appreciate it. Thanks, sir. My guest today is the world's reigning expert on expertise. And he has a powerful new approach to mastering almost any skill. His new book, Peak: Secrets from the New Science of Expertise. My guest today is Anders Ericsson. You've probably seen these talent books over the years, whether it's a book from Malcolm Gladwell or the talent books, Talent is Overrated, The Talent Code. All of these gentlemen, fine pieces of work, but all of these gentlemen, their influences, their foundations were all based on Anders Ericsson's work in the field of deliberate practice. Want to learn a language, pick up an instrument, but you're daunted. You want to master chess. You want to improve your ability in a certain sport. Anders' new work, Peak, condenses 3 decades of his original research to introduce an incredibly powerful approach to learning. It's fundamentally different from the way that we grow up learning. I feel very lucky to have this guest on my show. And his work was influencing me way back when I was doing the Turtle book. He was laying the foundation, the academic foundation for why the turtles were successful. I talk about deliberate practice in The Complete Turtle Trader. So Anders Ericsson has had a long influence on my work too. I hope you enjoyed this great conversation with Anders Ericsson. Let me jump in with my first observation, and this is just kind of a big picture idea to get the audience into the direction where we're going to go. But I don't know if you saw the news the other day, and of course you follow a lot of sports figures, but Stephen Curry is probably the best basketball player in the NBA today. He's not a very big guy, so not huge physical attributes or anything, but he has hit three-pointers like they're going out of style. And the other day he just rocketed up. I think he had 12 in one game, which was an NBA record. And I posted something on my Facebook. I said, wow, and I just finished reading Peak, and I said, this is all a result of deliberate practice. And immediately somebody jumped in and said, oh no, he was born with it. His father played in the NBA. It's the genes. And I thought to myself, I wonder what the professor would say.
I think we know of a number of father and sons that were successful in sports. And I guess it kind of raises the issue here of, why does that happen? And I think there are basically, two sort of extreme accounts. One would be, that you're born with the genes that allow you to do it. The other one is that you're basically born to a father who very early on helps you basically guide your practice in such a way that once you reach adolescence and adulthood, you've now had this practice history that can explain now your superior performance.
You've spent your adult life, and you say this clearly, studying the secrets of extraordinary performers. I mean, this has been your passion. Why don't you go back in time and let the audience start to understand how this became your passion? What were the triggering moments early in your life? If there was probably more than one triggering moment, but if there's any particular moment where you really would have started to have for yourself the aha moment of like, wow, I really want to go down this practice route, this deliberate practice route. Where did that start for you?
I think I would go back to pretty almost high school, where I guess I was, and I think a lot of people are interested in trying to understand how they can get better. I was interested in reading biographies and look at people who I really admired. And I guess as I started my doctoral work, I kind of wanted to understand the thinking, to kind of find a method that could tap into what the experts were thinking when they, were exhibiting this superior behavior. And I think that was kind of the key step here, because at that time, there wasn't really all that much work. People were very skeptical as to whether people actually could report anything, relevant that could explain sort of their superior performance. What I found was that when I studied task after task, people were reporting information that really helped to understand how they were able to achieve a higher than average performance. Now, the next step, I guess, was when I was invited to go and work with Herb Simon, who later got the Nobel Prize when I was a postdoc in his lab. The reason why I came to him was to really kind of put the ways that people express their thinking when they're engaging in activities within a theoretical framework that would help us sort of relate that information to models that could regenerate superior performance on various tasks, ranging from chess to mental multiplication and other kinds of activities. And then I kind of started working with one of the senior professors at Carnegie Mellon University, where Herb Simon was at the time. And we were interested in, is it possible for people to change sort of your capacity? And at that time, people thought that your short-term memory, how much you could think about at a given time, was really capacity that couldn't really be changed. And one way to study individual differences in that capacity was to read people series of numbers and see how many numbers would they be able to repeat back perfectly. What they found was around 7, which is, I guess, a phone number pretty much.
That's it, just 7 at that time.
Well, that was sort of the average performance. If you put somebody into a lab situation and read them series of digits, they were basically able to get 7 numbers 50% of the time. So that was kind of their limit. They would be even better if you only read them 6 digits, and they would be virtually perfect if you only read them 5. But basically, the number of digits that you could hold on to and report back exactly in order was on the average 7. And I guess there's a famous paper that says 7 plus minus 2. So basically something between 5 and 9 kind of captured what average people could do. We then started to ask the question, if you give people practice on that particular task, can they actually improve performance? What we found a volunteer, and that volunteer, after about 40 hours, was able to do over 20 digits. So basically, by now collecting verbal reports on what changes in his thinking processes were developing along with his increased ability to do this task, we got a better understanding here on how people could improve their memory in this particular task. And with even more training, he got it so he could actually recall sequences up to 80 digits. And we trained basically a friend of his, and he was able to get over 100. And we've studied some people now recently in China who at the time had the world record, and they're able to do over 300 digits.
At this time, were you starting to, was the insights as to how to break through those thresholds, those were starting to piece together for you and your team and your associates at that time?
Yeah, and I think that was kind of a key insight that came actually a couple of years later when people were starting to ask me, who cares if you can remember digits? So, okay, you've shown here that this performance, which seems incredible, is trainable, because obviously when you train an individual, the same genes, the person's genes and the DNA doesn't change just because you give them training. I mean, it's obviously the same in the beginning of training as in the end of training. The key question then was, and the way I started to think now, we're focused on if you can train that particular performance and that particular task, can you actually use training to improve performance, not generally, but basically improve it on other tasks like planning when you're making chess moves or when you're making medical diagnoses. And I think that was kind of the key insight, that if you could train one specific task, and that was consistent with what we found even in the memory for digits case, because if we tested this guy who could do 80 digits, he could only do about 6 consonants. So it was a very domain-specific skill, so he actually was able to improve his performance and his memory capacity, but it was limited now to a particular type of material and a little bit to the kind of characteristics of the task more generally. But if you apply this generally now and ask, if you give somebody else a different task, can you actually design training such that this individual will be able to break through sort of the performance that they, currently have?
Now, the practice, at least if we stay with the numbers memorization example, the practice, this was not just, and to use some of your terminology, this was not just naive practice. This was very purposeful practice. You might want to take the audience down the path as we start to break this apart, thinking of what purposeful practice is compared to what maybe many of us novices might think of as practice.
One of the keys, if you're going to practice, is that you get immediate feedback on your performance. And I think that is one thing that when people are, especially in professional context, you often have to wait to know whether you were right. So a doctor diagnosing a patient, they obviously will try to do the best they can, but they really don't get feedback on whether they were accurate or not until much later, and sometimes never. In this kind of memory task, we could tell him immediately, once he tried to recall the digits, whether he made any mistakes. So that actually gave this feedback loop. So he could actually, think about what he was generating, and he kind of formed meaningful associations primarily to running times, to group them into, 3 digits that would be sort of a mile time. So 4 minutes and 32 seconds would be, a very good mile time for basically an amateur athlete. He was then able to kind of realize when he made mistakes how he could then try to experiment and come up with new types of ways of encoding the digits that allowed him then to progress and be able to remember longer and longer sequences of digits.
And to jump to another example, which I just find fascinating, and I'm sure the audience will, and you can take as much time as you'd like to give as much color as you like, and having once lived in London and witnessed and observed the street setup in London and how the taxis worked, and I walked those streets like crazy back in the mid-1990s. But taxi drivers in London are a special breed, and they have to go through intense training, and they have to learn a lot about London streets. And that learning, and this is why this book Peak that you've put together with your co-author is fantastic. That learning, the learning of the streets by the taxi drivers in London, this changes the brain physically. I mean, there's an altering of the brain. Why don't you start from the beginning with your London taxi driver story? It's just incredibly fascinating.
I think the taxi driver story is particularly interesting because here we're talking about people, cab drivers, who aren't really special in any way, and in fact they've tested their cognitive abilities and found that they're pretty much normal people. But given that they have, in order to sort of pass this test that allows them to be cab drivers, they will be tested on given arbitrary kind of starting points and end points, and then they have to, from memory, kind of report what would be the most efficient path to take a passenger between those destinations. And this is something that they've done now well before we had GPS and all this electronic help. And it ended up taking actually, many years of training for these people to pass this qualifying test. And essentially what you found was that the end time they kind of learned some, over 10,000 streets and all their kind of interconnections. And when basically McGuire in England tested, she scanned their brains, you found that actually these individuals who had achieved the mastered the map, actually their brains had changed. Way of understanding here how increased memory can actually influence the basically the structure of the brain, and there's now plenty of other examples. But her study was so interesting because she actually analyzed and compared now cab drivers to bus drivers who are driving just as much, and in a sense have just as much experience, and found now that the bus drivers did not exhibit these brain changes that were associated now with mastering the map of the London streets.
One of the more interesting and cool aha moments that I think any of us learned people that want to learn about how things really work, it's just one of those great moments where you're like, wow. And I think it gets even more interesting is that the learning of the streets by these taxi drivers in London. This is all about, as you will describe in our conversation today, deliberate practice. But, and correct me if I'm wrong, if one stops being a taxi driver, if one ceases to do this particular skill for, let's say, a decade, will you see a regression in the brain changes? Will the brain changes revert to the mean, so to speak?
We see that in a number of domains, that maintaining the practice is really key for maintaining high levels of performance. And I think a lot of people will recognize that when they stop exercising, their performance after a couple of years reverts back to the normal level. And that seems to be a key in all the skills that we've looked at, that without practice, you basically revert back to where you started if you wait long enough.
There's some great examples in your work beyond even the book that we're talking about today. For many skeptics out there, though, I think they might look at some of these quote child prodigies, and they might try to draw inferences and conclusions. I can think of two in particular that you discuss in your book, and I'm going to let you choose which one you might want to exemplify in our conversation. Mozart, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, fantastic example. Everyone knows some general understanding of the brilliance of this very small child at a young age. And also somebody who's been on my podcast before. I think she was the first female chess grandmaster, and her sister, I think, is the current one, which would be Susan Polgar, has appeared on my podcast. I don't know if you might want to elaborate for the audience out there that wants to say, but Professor, Mozart, he was a child prodigy. He was born with it. Susan Polgar, or all of her sisters, they're all chess brilliance. What does practice have to do with this? Pick one of those examples and run with it, Professor.
Let's take Mozart, because I think he would be the one that most people be familiar with. And I guess what we're saying is you need to look at Mozart's upbringing. And one of the things that people don't recognize is that Mozart's father was a famous musician. And when Mozart came along, I guess he had some ideas about the possibility here of training young children. So he's actually the first person to actually write music training for basically younger children. So he invested pretty much his life trying now to both train his older sister, but primarily Mozart, in terms of providing him early with training. And what we say in the book is that some of the characteristics that Mozart exhibited, like, for example, his really remarkable ability to listen at a tone and be able to say which key on the piano produced that particular tone. More recent research have shown that is an ability that virtually that any child seems to be able to attain if you give them the training, but it has to be training quite early, similar to Mozart starting to play when he was 3 or 4 years old. You have to actually start the music training that early, and then the brain seems to be receptive to learning those kinds of distinctions, and you can then basically, as an adult, preserve those abilities. But it's very difficult or almost impossible for an adult to achieve those kinds of abilities if you start practicing at an older age.
You're a data guy, you're a research guy. So people out there that are listening, they might be thinking, well, I don't want my child to have such intense, deliberate practice at a young age. And you're not making a value judgment here. You're just saying the data shows us that peak performers, that there is something to be said for this early start in childhood. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, and I think I would like to just clarify. I think it's very important, if you want to produce a healthy, happy adult, that you actually, make sure that the training is consistent with what the child wants to do. So you're actually providing the child with opportunities for training. And I think this is, and I've had some contact here with Laszlo Polgar, who is the father of the 3 Polgar daughters who were so successful in chess. And that's kind of a really key idea of his, is that you actually have to put the child in charge, and you're actually helping the child to master whatever the activity is that you select. I guess there's all sorts of skills that if you want to become sort of a regular professional, that a parent can help the children acquire in sort of a motivating, basically very supportive environment.
Speak to brain plasticity. I think sometimes we, even though we're already in this conversation breaking open the idea that nurture can win out and that we all have this ability, as you speak to, it's not necessarily what you're particularly born with. We're born with the ability to go about and practice to get better. But why don't you speak to the plasticity notion? Because I think we really do get caught up in the idea of this fixed, that we're fixed. But in terms of being able to change, even if we go beyond the discussion of elite performers, our brain plasticity, this is something where average people that might want to start to master something later in life, we're not fixed in stone. We're not etched in stone, are we?
No. And I think one key that I found very helpful when I talk to people, adults who want to acquire skills, is to realize that the younger sort of prodigies, often they might spend, half an hour or something like that, where you're really training them with a very explicit goal, so they have to be 100% concentrated. But basically, if you push children to do a lot more than that until they're ready to increase their time of training, they're actually going to sort of feel that it's aversive and not be willing to do it. And when it comes to adults, if you want to run a marathon, I've heard people, who go out the first time and run for maybe 45 minutes, and then they're so sore that they never do it again. So basically that idea that if you're going to change your body, it's going to take gradual change. So you need to stimulate and push for change, but you can't basically go so far that you're actually harming the body and maybe pushing your motivation to a point where you no longer want to pursue it.
And in terms of making these achievements, improving ourselves, we are constantly up against homeostasis. We are constantly up against that we don't really want to break through those boundaries, and breaking through the boundaries is part of deliberate practice.
Yeah, and I guess I would say that if you're not trying to change something, you're probably not doing deliberate practice. So the key idea of deliberate practice is that you're trying to do something that you can't do well. And basically by figuring out ways that you can do this better, you will now basically raise your performance to a level that you didn't have before.
There's some great examples, and I think chess becomes a fantastic example. And one aspect of deliberate practice, so part of the understanding is chunking, or even the phrase, a mental representation. And I think we could imagine, I'm going to let you explain this, but if we're watching a chess game, that the best chess players, it's not about just looking at all the individual pieces on the boards. They're thinking in patterns. They've developed and they've pushed themselves over so much time that their ability as a chess grandmaster to analyze is based on pattern recognition. Why don't you speak to the notion of chunking, the mental representation, and using chess as an example?
I often try to basically take language. So if you're looking at basically a paragraph in English, people will read it and it will make sense. And if it describes some physical situation or interaction, people can actually form an image, a picture in their head of that interaction. And I would argue that the chessboard is a little bit the same for a skilled chess player. They can actually see the structure and now see what it is that are the weak spots and basically where, likely sort of attacks would be successful. By having chess masters think out loud when they're seeing a position and ask to pick the best move, we can actually see what are the features that they notice. And the way that they kind of probe the position is to make a move in their mind and then think up what the opponent's counter move would be, and then keep doing that maybe for 4 or 5 times or even more in order to kind of diagnose what would happen if they make a particular starting move. And I think understanding that that's really what's going on in the chess player's head really raises the question, how did they get to be able to do this type of thinking? And I think that gets to the core of what we've been studying here. You know, how do you actually build up these mental representations that allow you to think through issues in your head and basically then be able to kind of decide on what is the best action in a given situation.
We sometimes hear these examples of a chess player, a grandmaster, playing against 25 people at the same time or something, maybe even blindfolded. And it sounds so impressive. But what's really interesting about your work and what you've uncovered is that the chess, once you get to that level where you have put in the time to develop those mental representations in chess, that you're now, let's say, at grandmaster level, that in some ways, it's not really I don't know if this is the right phraseology, but it's not necessarily difficult for those particular players now at that level with that amount of practice. It's not particularly difficult for them to then play 25 people at the same time blindfolded. It's not like they're going down a whole new path. It's literally just kind of a parallel skill that comes along with having already got to grandmaster level. Am I describing that all correctly?
Yeah. And I think, you know, what most people find difficult to understand is how you can play blindfolded. So, you know, you basically have to make the chess position in your head and actually just think about it. You can't basically look at any kind of perceptual configuration. And that seems to be a skill that people don't practice. It sort of comes about from once you plan, now you can see the chessboard, but you actually have to make the moves in your head. And eventually, as you've been training that and been planning very deeply, you now have acquired the kind of skills that allow you, you know, just to more or less do it without the chessboard. You can do it completely mentally. And when you want to play several games, well, then basically you're just kind of doing that. And what I've heard here chess players do is that they try to pick different kinds of games, not to kind of confuse one chess game with the other. And there's a lot of maybe minor skills here that people actually acquire in order to be able to play multiple games. It's essentially the amazing thing is this building up of that mental representation that allows you to kind of, in your own mind, do things that people really need to have to do perceptually, seeing the chess pieces on the board.
And to build on these ideas further, I want to go back to an example that I brought up early on, the NBA basketball player Stephen Curry. And he won the MVP last year, but he's better this year. And when you get to this level of this very high achievement, it doesn't just stop. Some of these achievers, they just keep compounding on. You know, it's the one level of achievement allows you to get to the next level, and you can't skip steps, can you?
We certainly don't have any evidence, you know, that there's any sort of magical improvements. But basically, if you understand what the individual has been doing up to a given point, you can actually see the improvements, because that seems to be the things that they're working on to kind of keep improving. But I think that's a hallmark of an expert, being able, you know, to kind of monitor what they're doing so they can identify things that they can do differently or better. And once you're reached at that very high level, now you're actually able to kind of see things that other people wouldn't even be able to kind of see that you're still working on in order to improve, and then even increase your performance beyond your already exceptional level of performance.
And across your many years of studying expert performers, do expert performers ever really come out and say that their improvement was easy?
have had the chance here of being on a couple of panels with Olympic medal winners and musicians and chess players. And I've yet to find anybody who, once I've given a talk describing, who wouldn't sort of recognize this process, this incremental improvement, and this kind of continuous commitment that once you practice, you're going to do it with full concentration, because otherwise you're wasting your time. I guess that's one of those hard things, you know, in science. I can tell you I've never encountered anybody, but I can't prove that somebody won't basically appear here and basically be now the counterexample that I didn't know about. However, I would say that I've now been researching this for 30 years, and I probably encountered some 50 cases where people initially claimed that this was an exception. But by looking more closely at the evidence, I've been able to at least construct what I think is a plausible explanation that's based more on this continuous practice, even though the practice may not have been, you know, observed by a lot of people who thought that it sort of occurred spontaneously.
You know, there's been many, I think many is a fair word, many books that have been in popular culture that have been inspired or influenced by some of your work. I think some of those popular work would be Malcolm Gladwell's work. And there's a couple issues in his work that I would love for you to address. I think one, right off the bat, is that it has become really ingrained into society. And I'm sure I've been guilty of it too, because it's so easy just to say, hey, you become an expert at 10,000 hours. And I would love for you to address that, and then maybe even use the example of the Beatles and perhaps some of the misguided thoughts about how the Beatles actually got to be the Beatles.
I think what our research that we did on a music academy in Berlin showed that the most talented, or the ones that their music teacher viewed had the highest probability of succeeding as violinists, they were also the ones that reported having spent more time basically practicing by themselves. And we argue that this is very effective when you have a teacher telling you exactly what you need to do, and then you go ahead and do it. And if you do more of that, it's likely that you will actually be able to get better. We reported that those academy students, when they were 20, had on the average practice for 10,000 hours, which is a pretty amazing, huge number. And I guess Gladwell, was struck by this. So he came up with a rule that was a little oversimplified. He said that in order to achieve international level of performance, you need to have basically spent 10,000 hours. And he pointed to the Beatles as a group that played a lot of music in Hamburg, Germany, before they became famous. The issue that I would have with his statement is that there's really nothing that I know that makes it magical 10,000 hours. The estimates that I see for winning piano competitions would require these individuals to have spent more like 25,000 hours to win. And there are other skills where it seems like you can actually be world class in less than 1,000 hours of basically deliberate practice. So if we go back to Beatles, they spent a lot of time playing, and we actually went to some of the biographies of the Beatles, and they didn't play more than maybe around 1,500 hours in Hamburg, although, they said they were playing pretty much, 10, 12 hours a day. I guess what I would argue is a kind of even more important thing, that just playing in front of an audience, the only thing that seems to be able to improve to me would be your ability to play as a band. And the Beatles were really mostly famous for their ability to compose no music and then perform that music. how to explain now how they got to be better composers would make me look now for activities that were more directly related here to improving their composing ability. Again, here, you need a lot of practice, and we basically totally agree with Gladwell about that, but there's no magical boundaries. And maybe, as you were pointing out, some people who just count the number of hours they've been doing things, like driving, doesn't make them an expert just because they've done 10,000 hours of that activity. The key thing is to spend a lot of time where you're really trying to improve specific aspects. And if you can actually sustain that amount of training for thousands of hours, evidence shows that you're going to be likely to be exceptional. And if you can keep pushing that, you may end up, being world class.
Malcolm Gladwell brought up another issue that I thought was perfectly reasonable and made sense to me as a guy who had a late birthday for sports. I was a baseball player until my first year at college, but I think about his example. I believe it was NHL players, professional hockey players, and he talked about the birth date issue. Perhaps you could outline a little bit about the birth date issue. Did Malcolm Gladwell get it all right in the long run when it comes to the birth date issue?
I think that, and I find it very interesting, because if you are a coach and you're actually trying to pick out the most talented kids, it would make sense here that you're actually picking out the ones who are performing a little bit better. And what people found was that if you analyzed those who were actually succeeding and actually reaching the very highest levels, that they are much more likely to be born and be the oldest people in this age cohort that are practicing together as children and adolescents. So I think that is basically correct. Now, what people have pointed out is that these effects are not, incredible, except for certain types of very extreme situations where you're looking at 13-year-olds who were the best in soccer in England, where essentially there was really nobody born in the latter half of the year. So most of them were this part of this cohort that were the oldest among the soccer players that had been playing together.
I think one of the things that's really fascinating about this work, your work, is the motivational aspect. I mean, I get very motivated reading the book because you can't help but you just look at the research, you look at the data, you look at the stories, you look at the examples, and you say to yourself, wow, I can do anything if I really want to do something. But motivation's a tricky thing. And I just watched a movie the other day. I don't know if you've seen it. It's called Whiplash. It's about a jazz drummer and a very demanding teacher that pushes this young guy. And the young guy basically cracks at several points in time. He doesn't make it. But basically, at the end of the movie, the young guy accepts the instruction. He has the social motivation. He has the push, wherever it comes from exactly. Maybe it was the teacher, but he finally gets it. Something clicks. And why don't you speak to social motivation? Because I look at myself. I was very motivated by, I didn't want to be on the script that everyone else was on. I wanted to do something different. I wanted to go down my own path. And that motivated me to find success. And I can think of, without trying to bore you with all the details, but I can think of innumerable dead ends that were stopped. And I'm sure a lot of people would just quit and give up and go back to the day job at that point in time. But I just always felt like, don't stop, no quit, can't quit. And there's something in whether we're talking about extraordinary performers or the corporate world, because your work translates to the corporate world as well. The I can't attitude is a real, as you describe, a real red flag, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think I was struck by how convenient this idea of basically claiming that you can't or that you lack the talent. Because in some ways, if you look at learning, say, a foreign language, I've encountered a lot of people who say that they can't do that. Essentially what that means is that they're not going to put in any energy, because why would they? if they're basically just going to waste it. But it's interesting, and I actually encountered one colleague of mine who fell in love with basically a woman who only spoke Spanish. He was part of this group who had real difficulties learning languages. He was sufficiently motivated, so he was quite successful here in mastering Spanish because he had a concrete sort of reason. And also, I think in some ways when you're basically interacting with another individual, it's a pretty good learning environment where you get immediate feedback about whether they understand you or not. And I also think that it's interesting when it comes to music teachers. A lot of teachers, basically, it's convenient to basically tell some student here that they lack talent because they're not willing and able to make progress. So it almost takes away the responsibility of the teacher to actually help the student get the motivation that they need in order to progress. And once we look here at motivation as something that teachers, especially good teachers, are able to instill in their students, then I think it changes a little bit how we look on education. And similarly, if we can convince students that they actually, if they are able now to find the right kind of training that actually will help them improve, that will, give them motivation and confidence that they can actually succeed. Because it is sort of a magical paradox that if you don't believe that basically you're going to get any better, it may be very difficult to motivate yourself to put into practice. And basically that belief that you're not going to get better almost needs to be changed before it really makes sense for the teachers and the students to invest in this, gradual progress of getting better. And I also think that having good metrics so the student can really see how they're getting better is really key, because just sort of doing things and not getting that immediate feedback that we, see is an essential component of deliberate practice, you don't really have a sense that you're getting better. And that, may just confirm your sense here that it's a waste of time.
As you talk about getting better, I'm thinking of an example, and I want to kind of combine some things, but I'm thinking about comedians. I'm thinking about guys like Jerry Seinfeld, Jay Leno, Gary Shandling, people that put immense hours on stage in small comedy clubs in their early 20s. And then 20, 30 years later, they become some of the biggest celebrities out there. I think what's really interesting about comedians, and you talk about this with chess grandmasters, but chess grandmasters will go about studying their predecessors. They will find and look at the games of those that have come before them. I think comedians are very interesting about that, where it seems like comedians are always very willing and able to talk about who came before them. And there seems to be a tremendous amount of studying as well in comedy. I'm not necessarily sure it's a direct connection between the very different domains, but why don't you speak to the idea of studying your predecessors? Many people like to imagine I must invent it out of whole cloth. I must come up with it on my own. But, look, there's been a lot of people before us that have done really well. And you've seen in your work that those expert performers, they look at the experts before them, don't they?
Yeah, and I think that gets to, this effective learning. And we see in all sorts of domains where, like, for example, mathematics, the claim was in the, 14th century that it would take a lifetime here to understand math. And basically this was referring now to mathematics, that you pretty much, if you're an advanced student in high school, you basically have mastered this, because in the 14th century, they basically had to rediscover it for themselves. And now, basically, you can actually get that information from math teachers and basically math curricula. And the same thing in music. The level that people are playing today is vastly superior to what they were doing in the 19th century even. And these historical changes are directly a result here of actually younger individuals finding teachers who will be able to fast track them to learn things in the correct way, such that they get closer now to the frontier, basically where they're now going beyond what any current living musicians have done in order to create that unique contribution. And I have to say that virtually all of the major creative individuals, I mean, for example, Mozart, his father had him copy music pieces by other composers as a way of learning the structure of making music compositions. Picasso, he was excelling in the more traditional forms of, drawing natural scenes, and he was basically acquiring the techniques that then allowed him to basically now redirect them towards doing things that hadn't been done before. But the technical background of being able to actually make what he was seeing in his mind's eye, that was techniques that he had acquired, as a very as an adolescent. So I think people are afraid that they're somehow going to erase their unique contribution. I see more that you need the tools so you would be able to actually be able to realize whatever contribution that you are going to be making. And being afraid here that, learning these tools will somehow remove any originality, I don't find very good evidence for that.
I want to shift into something slightly different for a second in this whole topic area of your work. But I love the example because as a guy that used to play baseball and now I practice a lot of yoga, but as a right-handed hitter, I know that I have a big difference between my right and my left hip. And I can imagine after doing that for 12, 13 years, there's just differences. You do that much hitting and you lean all your weight on your right leg, something changes. I think one of the most fantastic examples to really give people a flavor for deliberate practice and what can happen physically to changes is that a great tennis player like Roger Federer, so much practice at such a young age, it's not just the muscles and the arm that holds the racket that's changing. It's the actual bones, isn't it?
It's really far-reaching, the kind of changes that you can observe. And if we're talking about bones, we know that height really can't be changed by training, but the thickness of the bones actually is influenced by training. And it's pretty clear what the mechanism is. So in your arm that you're hitting the tennis ball with, that creates vibrations in the bones that then actually releases chemicals that now stimulate bone growth. So if you take x-rays of tennis players, the arm that they are holding the tennis racket has much thicker bones than their left arm. But if we look at other activities, I guess when it comes to muscles and even, especially if we look at endurance athletes, the whole heart actually is restructured to maximize now the pumping capacity of the heart. So even the arteries are growing to allow for more blood with oxygen to circulate. And we also see more capillaries surrounding those muscles that need a lot of oxygen to be able to sustain, running or swimming or whatever the endurance activity is.
It's just quite amazing that, not only can deliberate practice develop a skill, increase a skill, it's changing the structure of the mind, the brain, it's changing the body. It's quite amazing what we as human beings can do with practice. I sound too excited probably, but it's really motivating when you've dedicated your life to studying this. And I look, I've not read everything that you have done in your career, but if you spend many, many decades doing this, it's going to be up to other people to come along and say, well, Anders got all this wrong. That's going to be a tough challenge, isn't it?
Again, here, I guess I'm doing my best to try to keep up with developments and genetics and other domains here to see, are there any relevant evidence? And what I think is quite interesting in genetics, people believed here that once we were able to describe the DNA, that we would find these differences in genes between elite athletes and basically other people who didn't have any sort of obvious genetic problems. But that research has really kind of not uncovered any sort of individual genes that somehow would explain why some individuals are basically performing so much better than other individuals. Personally, I think there's pretty interesting evidence here that training history of these individuals provides a much better explanation here for the individual differences that we see. And even if we take something like the outstanding performance of Kenyan runners, when you basically look at the kind of training history that they have and the benefits of training at a high altitude as very young children and being forced to basically run long distances to school every day and doing so in a very hilly countryside would seem to, provide some interesting ideas here about what actually may contribute to differences that we see in performance.
A lot of people have talked about those particular runners with the barefoot running playing a role as well.
Exactly, and I think that's very interesting that basically once you start looking at what sets apart.
He was at George Mason University. For those of you that might not know, Vernon Smith has Asperger's. And so a lot of people out there will say, hey, but what about some of these savants, a guy like Vernon Smith? And I thought it was really interesting when I went to interview him. It was his college office, and we were setting up cameras, lights, and everything. And I said, well, Dr. Smith, we're going to kind of bug you here, and we're going to be making a lot of noise, setting everything up. And he looked at me and he just said, I will never hear you. And it was such an interesting comment. Here's a man who's won the Nobel Prize. He has Asperger's, but an intense focus. And I wanted, in 6 months after that, I was at the offices of one of the most successful hedge fund managers in the world. And we were actually chatting in the bathroom. And I mentioned to him that I had just seen Vernon Smith, and we started talking about Asperger's. And he said, oh, yeah. We've got a ton of guys that work with us at our firm that have Asperger's because these guys can focus like no tomorrow. Why don't you talk about, though, because there's some people out there listening, they might say, well, Mike and, Professor Vernon Smith, he's got this unique advantage. But it still comes down to the practice. He's got the ability to focus. But talk about, why don't you address that issue when people have talked about savants and perhaps guys and gals that might have a perceived advantage being on the autistic scale or spectrum?
No, I have to say that I have not personally done any research on the issue here of Asperger's and basically these kinds of syndromes. But I agree with you that all I know, and I've basically been working now with numerous expert performers, that when you put them into the lab, one of the things that is so amazing is how they more or less kind of start out being relaxed, and then as we get closer here to the actual test phase, how they actually become completely focused, and they basically are able to sustain that. And I don't know, and I think that would be interesting research, whether there are individual differences in how able people are of actually getting into that a state of full concentration. But to me, that is one of the prerequisites for actually being able to stretch yourself, is that you actually put all your attention and resources on actually improving whatever aspect that you've picked out. And I would argue that basically when I talk to these individuals, they sort of tell me how important it is for them to get enough sleep. So basically that idea here is that in order to be able to exhibit full concentration for maybe 3 or 4 hours a day, you need to have a lot of time for relaxation and recuperation. And that balance here about basically, and maybe there are people, I've yet to find anybody who seems to be able to kind of concentrate for, 5 hours every day for years. There seems to be sort of that upper limit of around 4 or 5 hours that people actually can. And the ones that we have the best data on are authors who basically go off somewhere where they have no other responsibilities, but still they only seem to be writing for about, 4 or 5 hours in the morning, and then use the rest of the day to sort of more or less recuperate, so they would be able to wake up refreshed and then get in another 4 or 5 hours here of very productive writing. And I've talked to surgeons and other individuals who basically are quite aware of that issue here of balancing that level of full concentration with recuperation. And if you want to basically maximize how much you're putting in and getting out of writing, you like to kind of keep on a pretty stable daily schedule. And I don't know if you have any experience relevant to how some of these very successful individuals organize their day to maximize their ability here to, when they are concentrating, to really maximize the outcome.
Well, having written 5 books myself, I can. It's really interesting. We're talking about focus. Is that you're right. You can only stay focused for a certain amount of time. I think the interesting thing for me for focus is when those moments happen inside intense focus, that you enter the flow state. And you can talk about this some, but when you enter that flow state, time can stand still. Time just goes away. At least in my experience, it disappears. And you could just maybe you don't achieve a huge volume of work, but the quality and the precision that you can sometimes find in a flow state, it's quite addicting to get there.
I think this is very interesting and something that I guess I've commented on a couple of times and even had a chance to talk to Csikszentmihalyi about. A lot of people refer to flow as kind of highly enjoyable, but I think several people have pointed out that if you reflect on being in a flow state, you're no longer in it. So it's almost like you can only kind of know that you were in a flow state afterwards.
Exactly. 100%.
Right. And basically I think some people have even viewed here the flow state as actually being kind of this totally relaxed state where you're more or less just playing, so like if you were to dance and just do exactly what occurred to you, that's a flow state where you're not really trying to impose some constraint on what you're doing. And I would argue that the flow state that you were referring to, when you're really focused and you're actually engaged in doing something, is more like you're so focused in it that time, you're not longer aware of the time that you're investing. So it's almost, once you're kind of getting out of it, hopefully sometimes because you really feel that you've reached the end state of something that you were trying to work on, that's when you get the sense here of how time more or less just disappeared. But those two different states here, the kind of the playful enjoying when somebody is going down skiing and just having the sense here of total effortlessness, is a different kind of phenomenon than the one where you have that, sustained focus and where time just disappears.
Usually I know it's time to come out of those types of states. Either one of two things: I'm hungry or I need to use the bathroom. It's really, because otherwise when you're in that moment, you don't know. I would love to talk about the notion of solo and group, because I wonder, not even I wonder, but I know there's a talk about the notion of deliberate practice from a solo perspective, meaning that this is deliberate practice is difficult. It's hard. It's going to take a lot of effort, but it's not something you really don't do it with a team, do you?
I think that given that you're really trying to improve some aspect of your own performance, that basically makes it, to optimize the benefits of deliberate practice, you have to be in control of your own training. And I often sort of mention this example with playing doubles in tennis and you miss maybe a backhand volley, and then the game just kind of continues. You get another opportunity maybe, 30 minutes later, and you're not going to do that any better. So if you compare that now to a training situation where you have full concentration and available resources, like a coach. So the coach will now give you basically backhand volley that's really easy, and you're standing up by the net. And then basically as you're perfecting basically your control over this, it becomes increasingly more difficult because now, he's placing the volleys in a more difficult way, and eventually you have to move away from the net. And then, the end point is that you're rallying, and then he's including sort of a backhand volley within the rally. 1 or 2 hours of working with a coach like that, I believe, is going to improve your backhand volley so much more than maybe a year or two of just regular practicing with your friends, basically playing games.
As I think about your career, so here you've spent a lifetime studying expert performers, but you have your career has also been about deliberate practice. You have been in the deliberate practice of studying deliberate practice. Why don't you talk about some of the changes and the growth that's taking place in yourself to the extent that you can or want to? I'm really curious because this is true. You've also, anyone that has a very focused direction in life, there's a lot of deliberate practice. Talk about some of the changes you think you've seen in yourself over your career.
That is some interesting questions. And I think I would point to a couple of sort of important events. When I started my career, I was, like most people, really consumed and sort of spending a lot of as much time as I could on all the various activities, ranging from teaching to doing research and doing all sorts of things. Then I got the opportunity to go to Max Planck, and this is where we did the research on the violinists at the Music Academy. And that position was a little bit different. I didn't have any teaching. I had a lot of free time. And I think that was the first time I realized that I could put in more hours working hard than I could really profitably get benefit from. So this kind of that sense here of that there was a maximum. So in order to really write, it was better for me to kind of set aside 3 or 4 hours of writing and then basically, have other activities that would be less demanding, was a much better way and made me feel much better than basically this idea here of trying to, get every minute in doing various things, because when I was a regular academic professor at University of Colorado, basically I didn't have any free time, so I didn't really have control over my time. And I think that kind of idea here that you need to sort of take control over your time, and also maybe even say no to activities, so you can basically make sure here that it's aligned here with your priority here in terms of what you really want to put in your best hours on. And I've talked to a lot of people since that period, and they found that to be a very, very useful idea. And I think for people to set aside maybe 1 or 2 hours for writing or for thinking about big projects or something, but basically having those hours scheduled, I think has made a big difference to a number of people that I've had this discussion with. And I think when it comes to issues here relating to doing science, I would argue that deliberate practice, at least in a very generalized way, that really corresponds to seeking out people who disagree with you. And I found that, some people in research, don't like to be criticized and get annoyed. I've tried, basically to establish dialogues with people who basically have different views. And I find, similar to the deliberate practice, instead of doing things that, I've done and talking to people who agree with me, trying to convince people who don't agree with me often generates a lot of references to new stuff that I didn't know about. And by understanding maybe people who disagree with me better, I can do a better job here describing what I think is a compelling evidence. So that's kind of on a very general level. And I guess I remember one time, again here, that was sort of a sense of satisfaction because you submit manuscripts and then you get reviews. And at one point I really felt that now I can actually anticipate, what the reviewers are going to say. Early on, I kind of got surprised by what they were thinking and what they were commenting on. It was a sense here of self-confidence when I felt like I could kind of anticipate what they were going to be concerned about. And sometimes you can disagree here about how compelling certain kinds of evidence is, but at least if you understand where other people are coming from, you're more likely, I think, to be successful than if you don't understand here, why they're basically upset about certain things.
You've talked to a lot of different athletes and probably professional organizations. I think you had some involvement with the Philadelphia Eagles a couple years ago. And I can think back, and you mentioned this example in your book. You talk about Jamarcus Russell. For those of you that might recall, was a very large, phenomenal quarterback at Louisiana State University. He left college as a junior. He was the first pick in the draft, and he flamed out. It just didn't make it. And then you look at a guy like Tom Brady with the New England Patriots. I don't really need to say anything, but I think he was pick 199. So my question is, it clearly we have not figured out a way yet, and those people in these very, professional sports is big business. They've not yet figured out how to project who is going to put in the deliberate practice, or have some teams figure that out.
Yeah, I think this is really interesting, and I guess I've had several chances here to kind of describe my view here that some of the best football players are also the ones that have the deeper understanding of the game. So I remember when I visited the Eagles, I had a chance here to talk to several of the players and coaches, and they were actually recommending some players that they felt, were really standing out. And I was kind of compelled here by hearing their history of how they, from early on kind of got responsible for kind of figuring out what other people on the team were doing and what the opposing team. So they really, early on started out having a very refined description of what was going on in the game. And I think that then gave them that ability here to assess here what was going on, and also what it is that they needed to do to be able to, behave in the most effective way. For some reason, I think that it's so commercialized in the National Football League that it's hard to get, help a coach doing this, because they have too many things and too many things going on. But it would be wonderful, if a coach was interested in investing resources, and I think that would involve very much kind of helping individual players, develop. But once you have a whole team, I think it's very hard to find the time and the resources where you actually will be able to help players. And some people may even say here, well, by the time you get to NFL, that's basically when you should have learned these things already. So maybe, college or high school might actually be sort of a better place to start introduce these ideas. And maybe, you would find people who are even more motivated here by trying to find a way here to develop more effectively.
Well, it's funny you mentioned that because I had a text conversation with a friend of mine who played professional baseball for a dozen years, and he now coaches high school athletes in the state of Florida. Many of these high school athletes that he coaches go on to play at places like FSU and play professionally. And I told him, I said, hey, you've got to pick this book up because your book, Professor, because I said it's so motivating, and if you can. I would have loved for someone to have told me the insights in this work when I was a very serious baseball player at the age of 15, because you get caught up in other things, and then perhaps maybe you practice really hard and you get to a certain level, but then you plateau and you don't necessarily know you're plateauing. But if you would have had the insight of the deliberate practice, you can. Especially if one has the motivation, you can see that plateau more clearly and then perhaps push through it. So I think it's a fantastic way to think for young athletes in particular.
Yeah, and the part that I really like is that once you have a sort of a richer description of what you're doing, it now becomes much more interesting. And so it's sort of like as you get better in your understanding of yourself and basically the game environment, every game becomes more interesting because you have a more refined way of actually analyzing it. And then once you have the experience, you can go back and identify things that you can improve. And actually that satisfaction of identifying things that you can improve and basically have the sense here that it's almost like you're kind of reaching over sort of a peak of something, so you can actually see beyond things that you weren't able to conceive of. And I think that sort of psychological richness I think comes very closely along with this idea of representations and your ability here now to kind of evaluate your own performance and then use that as sort of direction for your own training and how you can then actually see how you're getting better. That rich sort of sense, when I talk to some athletes, they are kind of just doing what they're doing. They're not able to kind of have that appreciation of what's possible. And I think that getting that appreciation might actually make it much more interesting for them and thereby, enhancing all sorts of things related to the activity they're involved in.
And clearly, from my perspective, the work that you've put together is not age dependent. So I think I could have very easily got the same, maybe not exactly the same. I'm in my 40s now, but I could have really benefited from this type of understanding at a younger age. Let me ask one kind of little follow-up question to this, though. But for some of the child, I don't want to say prodigy, but after they've gone through deliberate practice at a very young age, perhaps we can call them prodigies. Some of the youngsters that you've studied, do they start to have this? When do they start to have this self-appreciation versus, they're involved in deliberate practice, but they might not necessarily see the entire big picture?
Well, and I think that is a finding that is sort of interesting with respect to prodigies, is that a number of music prodigies don't have successful adult careers. And some people have argued that if the parent is really taking over all the control here of the training, you're really not training somebody who is now going to be able to have their own representations and be able to internalize more and more of the training, so that when they reach kind of late adolescence and early adulthood, that they actually can go on by themselves and go beyond basically what the teacher was or the parent was basically helping them do. So I think that kind of idea here of allowing the child, to be sort of as Laszlo Polgar said, to be a co-author here in basically the process of developing your own performance is really critical. And I think that the more that you can sort of listen to the child and make sure here that, they are understanding and in some ways building up these representations that allow them to take over more and more. And I think that generates self-confidence, but it's also critical in order to kind of go beyond. So to keep moving ahead, you really need to have mastered and internalized all the things that you have acquired.
Well, I could keep asking questions all day. I appreciate the time today. Is there anything that I did not bring up today that you might want to elaborate on? Anything that's near and dear to you that you're thinking about right now, and all the papers and books that are on your desk are focused on something, or do you feel like we've covered the ground pretty good today?
Well, I thoroughly enjoyed talking to you, and I guess what I would say is if you find that when you're looking here at the material that there are some questions that, you would like to, ask again because of the way that I kind of answered them or whatever, I'm just willing to basically help you, because I find that the questions that you're asking, they deserve the best possible answer. And sometimes when you're trying to think as you're answering questions, it doesn't come out as smoothly as maybe would be ideal.
I want you to tell the website where people can go, whether it's your FSU website or a different one. But the book is called Peak: Secrets from the New Science of Expertise. And that's written with your co-author, Robert Poole. In the meantime, everybody can easily find you on your Florida State University website. It's been a few years since I've been in Tallahassee. It's actually been, my gosh, I think it's almost been, I want to say 20 years since I've been to Tallahassee. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, it's even more than 20. Time flies.
Yes.
It's been so enjoyable here. So where are you located?
I'm talking to you from Saigon today, Saigon, Vietnam.
Wow. Okay, but you're living in the States normally?
Well, I was living in the States till about 3 years ago, and then I started this podcast in 2012 after my fourth book. Then I got hired to do a speaking tour in Asia, and it was supposed to be a 3 or 4 month speaking tour for banks and hedge funds. At the end of that, I was living in San Diego. At the end of that, I said, well, I really don't want to go back to the States right now, so I stayed.
Wow. I guess sounds to me that somebody should interview you.
Well, it's it's kind of a crazy story, right? I mean, you've talked to a lot of people. Everyone's got a crazy story, right? There's always an interesting.
Well, I think that's one of the things. People who are very successful, I found consistently, are the most interesting and sort of people that I love interacting with. I view that as sort of one of the lucky aspects of my career choice, is that I've been talking to really wonderful people.
Yeah, that is true. And I think people will see that when they read your book, is it's really a phenomenal intersection. I think, look, people love sports in America, and you've just had a really great insight to talk to so many different people. And look, the great thing about this, if I can just keep beating this drum, is that whatever you might want to do, even if it's later in life, you've pointed out that people say they might want to run a marathon at 80 years of age. You might not compete in the Olympics, but you can drastically improve yourself at almost any stage of the game, can't you? And that's just motivating.
Right. And I think basically, that idea of the journey, that just doing it, but once you start looking at the experience of actually making the improvements and stuff like that, it's almost, that you get that excitement that some people get from climbing mountains. But here, it's something that you can do even if you live in the middle of a city, because most of the things are really happening in your own mind. And I think that kind of excitement, if I could contribute to providing people seeing that as an opportunity to, enrich their lives, I think that would make me very happy.
Well, it's loud and clear in this book, which is there's no excuses. If you want to do it, you can do it. You've got to buckle down and learn some about deliberate practice. Most anything is achievable. Congratulations. Really, really, people are going to know that. I mean, look, I've done a lot of podcast episodes, and people are going to know that I really enjoyed this book. So I appreciate your time today, Professor.
Oh, it was my pleasure. Maybe one of these days we'll run into each other, and I certainly would look forward to that.
Well, thank you very much. I will maybe have to swing through Tallahassee the next time I'm in the States.
Well, just let me know here, and I'll make a real effort here to make sure that I can meet you.
Okay. Thank you very much, sir.
Okay, thank you.
Now, this is why I do this podcast, for the chance to have a 90-minute conversation with the former CEO of Dunkin' Donuts for 35 years. Wow, how fortunate of an opportunity to jump in and get some history, to find out how things happened. My guest today is Robert Rosenberg. Now, his father started Dunkin' Donuts, and it was sort of small, kicking along. But Robert, once he got involved at age 25, his father made him president. I believe that's the right age. We'll find out if I'm wrong in the episode. But at age 25, he takes over as CEO. Now, right there, what an amazing story. Absolutely amazing. How many people get to be there at that opportunity? Well, the answer is not many. And I'm so, again, happy, fortunate to dive in deep with an original American story. And I got to tell you, the Dunkin' Donuts story has crossed so many financial thresholds, IPOs, takeovers, potential hostile takeovers. I mean, what a story. This is one of those books that you should add to your reading list. So without any further delay, let's jump right into my conversation with Robert Rosenberg discussing his book, Around the Corner to Around the World, a dozen lessons I learned running Dunkin' Donuts. But I got to tell you, this is one of those books where you're going to walk away with something. So dive in. Without any further delay from me, I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Robert Rosenberg. Let's go back way far in time. Your dad starts Dunkin' Donuts. Obviously, you get involved very early, but speak to me about the experience of growing up in an entrepreneurial household. You very proudly say that your dad had an 8th grade education, a guy with a presence you described coming into the room, a real presence, a big guy that would come in and kind of own the room. Talk about growing up in that environment with such an impactful figure.
He and the business dictated an awful lot of my early years, my early life. He was a figure that was bigger than life. He had started as a kid, as a real hustler, dropping out of school into the 8th grade to help support his family. And he started his career driving ice cream truck routes around Boston. He was very good at it. He really worked hard. He went into the shipyard during the Second World War, and his business really started after the Second World War. He had joined a business in Bridgeport, Connecticut after the war. And that partnership didn't last long. And it was called Industrial Luncheon Service, Meals on Wheels. It was trucks that went around to football sites where kids were playing football, or little office sites, construction sites where people would come out, stand in line and buy coffee and donuts and sandwiches. I remember joining him on those route trucks. That was years ago when I was about 8 years old in Bridgeport, Connecticut. And as the partnership failed, he basically took the same idea, moved to Boston. We moved in with grandparents, a section of Boston called Dorchester, and opened a small little commissary. Everybody in the family worked there. We scrubbed it up, got it ready. That business started to grow rather dramatically. My father took in a partner, his brother-in-law, who was a CPA, a guy he admired. My uncle put in $2,500. I think my father had $1,500 in the business. And that business grew to 150 trucks in 6 different depots all around New England. All we would talk about, for the most part, my recollection of my early childhood, is we talked business. It was always business at dinner. After school, I was just a youngster. I would go to this little commissary on the corner of Quincy Street and Columbia Road in Dorchester, and I'd clean out these 5-gallon coffee cans that were coming back from the route trucks. My mother occasionally made sandwiches for the route trucks. It was really a family enterprise, very humble beginnings. That business, as I said, started to grow, but it started to falter around 1948 or so. As vending machines started to come on the scene, it started to put a dent in the route trucks and the whole commissary system and all the overhead of driving trucks was putting a crimp in the business. As a result of that, my father and my uncle decided, based purely on happenstance, one of the people that worked in the commissary that made baked goods that went on the trucks said to my dad and my uncle, there's a donut shop around the corner that has 12 route trucks, and they make more money out of their one retail store than they do out of all 12 trucks. Guys thought that that might be the answer, both my uncle and my father, to starting to diversify their business to something that may be more long-lived. My father always wanted to be a millionaire after taxes. That was his dream as a young man. So they opened this donut shop in 1948 called Open Kettle. And it was in a converted stucco, formerly an awning shop. And it didn't do much business. It was a real disappointment. It was a bummer. Fortunately, the role of serendipity, a guy across the street who was formerly a band leader, owned a lot of land on this place called the Southern Artery, which is a road that connects Boston to the Cape, which is where this Open Kettle store had opened. This guy, Maury Pearl, a band leader who had popularized the song, The Sheik of Araby, decided he was going to open a donut shop too. But before he opened it, both my father and my uncle decided to hire away his architect. This architect came in and said, you guys are not doing yourself a favor with this stucco shop with no windows. And you might have some good products here, but no one really knows it. You got to shine a light on it. They ripped the store down. They converted, and he said, the name Open Kettle really doesn't tell you what's on sale inside. They sat down, had a brainstorming session. Someone said, what do you do with a chicken? You pluck a chicken and you dunk a donut, which is a skit that was popularized by a famous comedian on television in the 50s called Red Skelton. My dad said, that's it, Dunkin' Donuts, that's the name. So they took down this $1,500 a week Open Kettle store and they rebuilt this brand new fishbowl, California style shop operation, reopened it, same donut men, same store manager, same menu, same pricing. Everything's the same location, but a different design and a different name. And that $1,500 a week Open Kettle, which was doing about the same as most of the 1,500 or so donut shops that existed in Massachusetts in 1948, became in 1950 a restyled Dunkin' Donuts store and came out of the gates at $5,000 a week when coffee was a dime a cup and donuts were 55 cents a dozen. And it was a huge success. My life during that time was I figuratively grew up over the store. As a kid, when I was 14 years old, I started working in the kitchen at the commissary. At 15, I worked in the bakery. At 16, between high school and college, I pushed a canteen cart during the morning, cut cold cuts for the cold cut guy who did all the cold cuts in the afternoon. And then on the weekends, my father had a 50% interest in a Leaning Tower pizza chain. I made 1,000 pizzas a day on a Sunday, and a Saturday and Sunday on the weekends. So I learned sort of the restaurant business.
What's so great about that is I can imagine some young people today, they'll hear that story, they'll say, it's a long time ago, 70 years ago. But everything you just described from an entrepreneurial perspective can be redone today. We haven't even got to your part yet. We're just talking about your dad. I mean, everything about what you described is that perseverance, the grit, the trying things, the experimentation, all of that pervades is still just as important today.
Malcolm Gladwell in his book Outliers, if you look for success, you're going to find it uncommonly repeatable over and over and over again. Those people that spend 10,000 hours, which comes to about 3 to 5 years, in apprenticeship in their trade are much more successful than others. And I know that was true in my case. I spent my 10,000 hours or more over 10 or 12 years of working summers and school vacations and subbing for store managers and a wide variety of jobs. But I did learn the restaurant business. I totally agree with you. I think that the pattern was true 70 years ago, and I think it's true today. We're jumping ahead in the story, but years later, I taught in the graduate school at Babson. And my advice then, based upon the experience that Babson, which is one of the leading entrepreneurial colleges in the country, preach, was the secret to success. Not 100% of the time. There are serial entrepreneurs, but those people who want to improve your odds dramatically spend 3 to 5 years apprenticing in the industry within which you start your business. You will have to know the market, the customers, the niches, the openings, and where you can build a sustainable competitive advantage. Very hard to know if you don't know that business.
Let me keep it at your father for a few more minutes. He became an entrepreneur purely out of necessity, or was it just, I don't want to work for the man? Was that going on? What was the drive there for him?
And it's hard for me that we never did discuss that. I never really knew what his true motivation, but he was aspirational. He was a hustler. He was a big guy with a big personality and wanted to make a difference in the world. And I think when he went to work with these three partners in Bridgeport, I think he basically saw an idea that had legs. He could copy it easily and inexpensively. And as I said, we lived with my grandparents. My grandmother, unfortunately, my uncle had died in the Second World War. My grandmother had gotten money as a result of his death as a soldier. And she gave my dad some of that money to start a business. And I think we started with $1,500. It was a combination of factors.
Your neighborhood, Dorchester, I've not been to Boston for a very long time, but Dorchester is not exactly the high-end part of the city, is it? It's a little more rough and ready?
We were dirt poor. And then we didn't do much better for a while. We then moved to Roxbury. No, we lived with both grandparents, paternal and maternal grandparents at different times in order to launch the business. In the early years, like most early businesses, it's a learning curve and you have to wait. You have to be patient while it grows. And we did that. But as a kid, you really don't have any perspective. So for me, that was normal and quite acceptable. And I was enthralled. I idolized my father. He was bigger than life. I was absorbed by the stories of business and success and setbacks. I remember vividly as a 9-year-old, I took my first plane ride. We flew from Boston to Albany at DC-3. Our largest account at the time was the Waterville Elite Arsenal that made all of the big guns for the Army. And it was a big account. They were up in arms because my dad had gone from a nickel a cup of coffee to a dime. And I remember sitting in the back of the Union Hall as the delegates grumbled, and my dad took the stage and basically spent an hour trying to convince them, successfully, I should say, on the need for quality over price. And he carried the day. That left an indelible mark on me.
Let's bring it up to jump a little bit ahead. We've got a long timeline to work with here, but let's jump ahead a little bit to age 25. You're age 25, so you are a newly minted MBA. Is that correct at age 25?
That's correct. I went to hotel school and then graduated. I worked in the company for a while. And then I went into the Army as a reservist and then came out and went to business school.
And your father decides or looks to you or asks you and says at age 25, newly minted MBA, he wants you to be the guy that runs the business?
Yes. He was 47. I was 25. He was healthy.
What was your initial feeling at that?
It's kind of breathtaking and unexpected. And there were problems. My father wanted to be a winner and wanted to be a millionaire. But at the time, the business was at a crossroads. The partner he had taken in that didn't get along well on the fifth store in 1955, they broke the partnership up, and my father had a buy or sell arrangement with his brother-in-law, and he ultimately, some of which at my urging, he bought the business for the then book value, and he then began to spin out a number of different businesses. So my uncle took the money and began a competitive company after the fifth successful donut shop called Mr. Donut. That started to grow dramatically. And my father, at the same time, after the partnership ended, began to spin out a number of different businesses, a portfolio of food service businesses. We had a 15-cent hamburger chain, a la McDonald's. We had a number of pancake houses, copying International House of Pancakes. We had a vending machine company. We had a cafeteria company. We had a delicatessen. So we were in 7 or 8 little businesses, including some of our Dunkin' Donut shops. My dad and my uncle were very competitive. My father had long argued to the same, and they shared the same circle of friends.
Brothers, correct?
Brother-in-laws.
Brother-in-laws,
my
okay.
My mother and my aunt were sisters, And my uncle was married to my mother's sister's husband. It's a mouthful. But they were brother-in-laws and long-term friends and knew each other well. And as I say, my father, up until they became partners, admired Harry because he was educated. My father had this love-hate relationship with education. I suspect he never talked about it, but I suspect he regretted or felt that he was at disadvantage because he never got educated. And by the same token, he also oftentimes felt that he was smarter than guys that were book educated because he was so street smart and then became so successful.
That was probably true, though, wasn't it?
To some extent. The reason why is my uncle, unencumbered by this strategy that I call failed, basically was simplified, was just opening and spinning out these Mr. Donut stores. And my father had all these different businesses and basically was going nowhere in terms of profitability. Hired in an executive vice president to run the day-to-day business to try to figure out what was wrong. And the guy that was running it, the executive vice president, basically was losing confidence in the donut and coffee business. So the year before I joined in 1963, had opened nothing but full-service restaurants under the Dunkin' Donut name. He served hamburgers and hot dogs and a full breakfast menu with eggs and bacon and nothing more than a diner with anywhere from 18 seats to 89 seats. It was a hodgepodge of businesses. So here we had my dad, who was very competitive, very aspirational. His brother-in-law had a now chain that my dad had basically talked in their circle of friends that my uncle was nothing more than a bean counter and a millstone around his neck. But the facts belied that. The books at the time, the first franchise boom, the first book written on franchising, which dominated dinner conversation in my house, led off on the story of Horatio Alger, my uncle Harry Winokur, who was building the Mr. Donut franchise and barely mentioned my father on the 155th page as one of the guys that started the International Franchise Association. He was fit to be tied. They were on television giving away franchises. Everywhere he turned, his dream and his aspirations were being affected. So much so that in my second year of business school, I accompanied him to New York City to a private equity buyer, and he was asking $1.5 million to sell the whole business. He wanted out. And the business was only earning $100,000, and the private equity guy wouldn't pay it. And I had the impression that there were many people that he had talked to similarly who were unwilling buyers to make him the millionaire after taxes he always wanted to be. And I think it was in that backdrop of frustration and consternation that he turned to me, a green 25-year-old graduate, and asked me to take over the business. It took 6 weeks to make up my mind and ultimately decided after being there a while that the problem lay in leadership. And I thought I saw a way to success, and I agreed.
We're still in the period, let's say, between 63 and 68, well before that IPO. So once you get involved, you start to get your feet wet, you start to understand things. Your story is so roller coaster. The family story, the whole business story is so roller coaster for so many decades. It's an amazing, amazing story. But initially, once you start to take control, your father, though, also is still pushing for a sale. So here you are as the leader, as the president. There must have been some unusual moments when he was looking for that sale, and you were probably thinking, I'm a young guy. I think I can make this thing a lot bigger.
You're absolutely right. There was a lot of tension. I loved my father. I admired him. But increasingly, as I got my arms around the business, it became clear to me that we had a different life story. We had a different style, and we had different aspirations. And there was tension, but the business immediately after I got there, I changed the strategy of the company and started to focus. Brought in friends from business school to help me. We started to take off dramatically. And as the values grew, his intention to still sell was stronger. So before a few years, I was sitting in front of Nate Cummings, the conglomerateer who put together Sara Lee and Consolidated Foods in his beautiful apartment in the Waldorf Towers, and being offered $7.5 million to sell the business to Consolidated Foods. As you can imagine, that kind of offer, given the history that we had just a few short years before, created lots of conversation and, quite truthfully, a lot of tension. I decided not to sell, not to take the offer. We continued on from there. And Nate Cummings bought a company called Chicken Delight, which was a very successful chain, but had bad contracts, and as a result of the contracts, lost their business in a trouble action antitrust lawsuit. Yes, there were cross purposes.
So your father, though, he gave you the power, though. I mean, you and I can go through many corporate stories, and I think what's so unique about yours, perhaps there's some other names that I'm not aware of, but I think what's so unique about yours is at that point in history where franchising is taking off, you get to be in the catbird seat, making decisions, managing risk, taking chances, and starting at the age of 25. It's really an amazing story, huh?
It is. I have to give a lot of credit to business school. In my business school days, I had the opportunity to study under some terrific, very, very famous teachers. One who taught retailing, Walter Salmon, another guy who taught business strategy called Cy Tillis, Seymour Tillis. Those two classes were real-life laboratories where I could sit in business school and write my papers about the company that I was going to join as an apprentice called Universal Food Systems, that potpourri of 8 or 9 little businesses. It was there that basically I had the opportunity to be able to think through what would I do if I had the opportunity to run it, what works and what doesn't work. That was very, very useful to me. So when I came, I had a real understanding of the role strategy plays in the success of a business. It really does spell the difference in terms of what you want to be and what you want to have. That helped dramatically. And also the ability to be able to recruit some of my classmates, some of the best and the brightest, right out of school and out of Goldman Sachs is where they came from, 2 of them, both my CFO and also the head of administration. It was a band of brothers that were now running the company. It wasn't just me. Those were very, very helpful things. My father could teach me about quality, but he didn't have the experience of growing in a larger business. He was stymied. And I think that was the reason I actually got the call. Luckily, because of school, because of the context, because of the training, can't put an old head on a young body, but I had some inkling as to what to do. And I guess I had the ability to make decisions. I don't see myself as a very forceful personality. I certainly wasn't the same old as my dad. But whatever it was the right thing at the right time. We were very fortunate it worked out.
Now, before I bring us up to 1968, a really pivotal year, as I mentioned at the top of this podcast, you brought up quality a second ago, and there's an interesting or fun story in your book, and I think my Southern mother would probably say the same thing. There was an associate, a friend, I can't remember, a family member named Charlie, and the discussion was around pound cake and the secret ingredient. Why don't you tell that story? It's so good.
Yeah, my father had developed stage 2 diabetes, I guess, about age 50. So he would spend his time at Durham at the Rice House. That's probably not there anymore, but it was a rice diet that was guaranteed to cure what ails you under the auspices of Duke University. There he met a fellow by the name of Charlie Lubin. Charlie was a baker, and he had developed a pound cake formula and named it after his daughter, Sarah Lee. My dad comes back and says, Bobby, you got to go meet Charlie. Charlie's now living in Chicago. So I remember getting on a plane, flying out to Chicago, and Charlie invites me to his dining club high up on the Loop in Chicago. And we're sitting there at lunch. And I said, Charlie, my dad tells me that you really get good advice for a young guy like me. What would you advise me? And slowly but surely, Charlie, I think he grew up in Brooklyn, leans over the table and he says, butter. I said, excuse me? He says, butter. I said, I don't understand. He said, what do you think a pound cake is? I said, I have no idea. He said, a pound cake is a pound of flour, a pound of sugar, and a pound of butter. Goes on to tell me that there's nothing like the real thing. When you're dealing with food products, cream, butter, real fruit, I mean, that's the answer to really a delicious tasting product. And I remember on the ride home on the plane, I just kept mulling over in my mind. I said, here's this guy who built, he was a baker from Brooklyn who built this whole empire of great products, basically on quality. And my dad had done the same thing. My dad was a nut for quality. And it was the one thing he instilled in me from the time I was at the Waterville Arsenal, is always pick quality over price. Go for the best. Go for the real things. And I made a vow then on the plane ride home that I would do everything in my power over the years to be guided by that principle. So if I had to pick what separated us and why we were able to do so much better than the literally scores of other donut shop chains that were starting at the same time. There was Mr. Donut and Tim Horton and Winchell's on the West Coast. And in Texas, there was Shipley's and Lone Star. In Utah, there was Pelton Spud Nuts. There were lots of chains. In New England, Best Eaten. And so we were really surrounded by competition pretty much at the same size. We weren't all that dominant. And I think the reason we sped ahead and were able to get to the top of the pack was we basically focused on 3 Ps, I called it: planning, people, and product. Those 3 Ps. Product was the tri-legged stool. You pull one leg out, the thing would tip over. And we built our business over the years, really focusing intensely on those 3 Ps.
So you joined 63. The value of the business in 63 was around a little less than $2 million. Is that the right number?
Well, it must have been less than $1.5 million. Okay.
We're laughing, but we're not really laughing. We're just kind of like, I mean, the reason I bring that up is because we're going to go to 68 now and IPO. And all of a sudden, we've got a valuation at what? 120 million?
Yeah, the business started to grow when we started. Basically, what the strategy was to not to put any more assets and resources behind the other businesses, focus all of our attention on the diamond in the rough that was in our midst, which was Dunkin' Donuts. We standardized the Dunkin' Donut to a 20-seat operation, 52 varieties, originally 28 varieties of donuts, but 52, a 6-ounce cup of coffee in a porcelain cup that was served around a question mark counter, and a 6-ounce cup of coffee to go. So we highly streamlined it, and we said we wouldn't go and sell a franchise when anybody wrote us and wanted to open one. What we would do is we would try to focus our attention in certain markets. They're called statistical marketing sales areas, SMSAs, where we could build our brand, where we could advertise, where we could supervise. So we streamlined and focused and basically began to take throttle back, decide not to open any more businesses, and focus all our energy and attention, as I said, on the diamond in the rough that was in our possession, which was Dunkin' Donuts. And that business started to grow. So the earnings went from $100,000 within 5 years. We were up around $700,000 after tax profits. McDonald's had gone public a few years before. Kentucky Fried Chicken, we were the third one out. I had to sell a go public in order to be able to satisfy my pledge to my dad. The reason I told him we couldn't sell to Nate Cummings and Consolidated Foods and or to Nestle's, who was also nosing around in those days, basically was that we would come out far better. We were on a path. I had to figure out, when do you sell a business? I had to convince him. I was never successful really at convincing him, but I came to the conclusion, this is one of the things I'm most proud of, was you do not sell a business just because someone comes in and offers you a big price. If you love the business, if you have the ability to achieve your objectives, I'll say that again, if you have the ability to achieve your objectives consistently, then you shouldn't sell your business, because once it's gone, it is gone. And it's hard to reproduce that. It takes years. It takes a bit of luck. It takes the right timing. A lot of things have to be in place. And if you've got this opportunity to continue to grow your business and achieve your objectives, in my view, you don't sell. If you're healthy and you can see a way future clearly to keep growing, and that's what your goal is, see an opportunity to make it maybe generationally in your family, that's a huge asset and a wonderful, wonderful asset that should never be let go.
I love that advice, because I think that so many people imagine the pot of gold, but then maybe they have something successful going on and they think about getting out. They imagine the pot of gold. If you get out early and you have some pot of gold, what do? Just sit around?
The fact is, my dad, when he did get the pot of gold, even before that, when I joined, he left the office, never to come back, really, only for board meetings. He went to New Hampshire, where it was a cheaper tax state. He had made $4.5 million the day of the public offering in 68, 5 years later after I had taken over. And he started a horse business, and he built another business. He started to raise and race harness horses, which he loved. And he got engaged in legislation to create agricultural products to help stakes for big stakes races. He had partners in that business as well. And he did well up until 68 when he had a full dispersal. But he had to recreate himself, as did I when I left Dunkin'. It isn't the easiest thing in the world is to create second and third careers. Well, he did, and I did as well when my playing days were over.
That was my point, is I think ultimately us human beings are, if we have this way of thinking to go get it and to try and to take those risks, it just doesn't go away when you get older.
Absolutely. Totally agree with you. And so long as you have a breath in your body, if you have a project and you have a clear idea what you want to be and what you want to have, until that last breath, my advice would be to keep on trucking. That's the secret to, I think, degrees of satisfaction and then even some degree of peace. Even though there's some agita associated with your striving, it's a far better way to live a life. So I couldn't agree more.
You come out of the go-go 60s, you got the IPO going. I mean, things are looking pretty rosy. 73, 74 bear market, things started to change, huh?
It wasn't the bear market that started to change. It was me. Basically, I became involved in the International Franchise Association. At a young age, I was scheduled to take over the chairmanship in 1970. The guy ahead of me in the chairs was a guy by the name of Al Lappin, a California guy, 10 years older than me. And his vision was basically that franchising was a vehicle where you could basically plot out lots of different business and use the franchise system of distribution as the common core. And he tried to buy the company, Dunkin', and I wasn't interested. But I became intrigued by his idea that franchising, and I had been growing at 50% a year compounded in earnings for the prior 5 years, and I was intent on trying to keep that rate of growth up. It was heady. I was sitting on top of a business now that was worth, on my 30th birthday, maybe $160 to $200 million in terms of market value. My head was turned by public ownership and the need to keep up the pace, the beat. And I changed the strategy of the company from being a very focused donut and coffee company. And I began to sell off all the other businesses rather quickly. I sold off the cafeteria and vending company to Canteen, closed down the Howdy Beef and Burger hamburger stands, closed down the pancake houses, and got out of all the other businesses, all the extraneous businesses. So I focused. We went public, not as Universal Food Systems, the company that I took over, the portfolio of businesses in 1968. We went public as Dunkin' Donuts. I began to think about a change in strategy from a focused donut and coffee company where we've been very successful to a portfolio of franchise businesses as a way to keep the beat up. Bad mistake. As a result of that, we lost our focus. We started a fish and chips chain. I was creating franchise learning centers around the country. I was talking to Hat Corporation of America about a series of retail haberdashery stores around the country and took my eye off the ball, tried to do too many things at the same time, growing too quickly, pushed the organization. And we began to start to flatten out earnings. And then ultimately in 1973, we lost $1.7 million. And luckily, someplace in the early 70s, I realized the error of my ways and started to change. But I was leading the company off a cliff. I was doing the very same thing my father had done 20 years earlier.
But did you have anybody, a mentor or anyone pointing it out? Or is this self-reflection that you decided, man, I've gone the wrong way?
A combination of both. When we went public, we had to bring in a board of directors. And the board of directors comprised of my father, myself, one of my professors at business school, Milt Brown, the Lincoln Filene professor, and a lawyer friend of ours who had helped us create a stock option program, who was a partner, soon to be the managing partner of Ropes and Gray, a very prestigious and wonderful law firm in Boston. And that was the board. And Milt turned to me and said, Bobby, you can always tell how long people know me by what they call me. Bobby were the people who know me the longest. So Bobby, he said, I think it's time to get out of all these businesses. Just focus, really focus. I know you've withdrawn all the resources from behind them and you're not growing them and you're not creating new ones, but I think it's time to fish and cut bait. And that was very influential. And when I started to spin out a lot of stores, I was not only changing the strategy of the company, I was upping the beat in terms of store openings to up to 140 a year for Dunkin' Donuts. Archie Southgate, the lawyer from Ropes and Gray, says, what would happen if you grew at 40 stores a year and you basically cut back and you weren't pushing the organization so far? Would you create more stability? And my first reaction was, I can't do that. Stock price would fall and this would happen. I had a lot of reasons. It was hard to change directions. Luckily, I had taken a course again at business school and knew of this new phenomenon that was occurring over at MIT called modeling and the ability to model by computer. the head of IT for the company had been an MIT graduate. And I said, Tom, can you do this? And he said, yeah, I can create a model easy. And before I knew it, I had a model, and we as senior managers sat around, and lo and behold, we could drop the pace from 140 openings to 40, get our arms around the business, stop diversifying, go back to our core business. And I had done that before we had taken the launch. I realized the error of my ways, partly because of these two advisors who were board members that had given me direction. And luckily, I liked them and respected both of them, and that helped a lot. There is a big advantage. It doesn't have to be a board of directors. It could be advisors. It could be friends. But to have a forum where you discuss your business issues can really be a huge benefit to people running businesses or running your life for that matter. You can use the same processes, the same planning processes we used. Believe that. I use the same processes in designing my own life. I think it's worked out okay. So anyways, yeah, the answer to your question was a combination of some self-introspection. And that's, I think, when the introspection came. Our franchisees became restive as we started to take our eye off the ball and began to diversify. We weren't giving them the attention, and the profits started to sag. New product development wasn't as prevalent. I was sitting in my living room reading this book by David Halberstam. You ready for this one now?
Jump in.
Basically called The Best and the Brightest. It was a story about Johnson and the prior Kennedy administration and their management of the Vietnamese War. What Halberstam was contending was that both administrations had put in power in place the best and the brightest that America had to offer. All these Ivy Leaguers who were well-schooled and well-educated, smart, whiz kids, but they suffered from one thing. He called it hubris. It's the Greek word for arrogance. And they really weren't going into the hamlets and the townships to really talk to community leaders to find out what was really happening. They were relying on death counts and statistics in order to measure the success of the war. And that's really wasn't where the war was being won. It was being won in the hamlets, in the hearts and minds of the townspeople. They failed at understanding that. And I'm sitting in my armchair reading this book, and it strikes me, I said, oh my God, Halberstam could be talking about us. And as a result of that, I went back to the team, and we sat around, and we talked about this. As leaders, we are never going to we're never going to fault the followership. We're never going to blame the followership. It's our responsibility, 100-0, to create a system where average people or well-intentioned people can succeed and flourish. We are going to take them in and make them allies and have them help us fix what we did wrong, acknowledge our mistakes, and take them in. And we began, each of us, to visit 100 stores a year, every year, talking to franchisees, traveling with our district managers, seeing if our management by objective system had been working. We created a very strong, viable advisory council system where franchisees elected leaders at district levels and regional levels, and then actually at the national level. We met quarterly with these people on an agenda that was very clear and specific, and very clear objectives, both in the district level, regional level, and the national level. And slowly but surely, we began to regain trust. The litigation ultimately got resolved. It took years, but ultimately got resolved in a most unusual way, where over 60% of our franchisees opted out of a class action lawsuit against the company. We began to right the company. Quite truthfully, I don't think we ever looked back after that kind of learning experience. And if you can live through a failure, and if you can live through really a significant setback and not be devastated by it, and sort of grow through it, it leaves you, in my experience anyway, is a lot better off than you were before. And that's what happened to us. And it all started with a book. The right message at the right time. My brother, I have a younger brother, he's 11 years younger than me, but he would attend a lot of these self-help programs. And he would remind me often, he said, when a student is ready, a teacher will appear. And that's exactly what I have found in my life. When I'm wrestling with a big issue, really wrestling with it, that either a seminar, a colleague, a book, chance meeting with another CEO, the lesson often appears through that teacher. And teachers come in all forms. A lot of my teachings come from my own teammates, my own colleagues. I think that's where the greatest learning I had. And it's a journey. I certainly didn't know these things at 25, and I didn't even know them that well at 35 or 40. it's been a continuing process and a wonderful one.
To keep it at Halberstam's book for a moment, and for those listening, The Best and the Brightest by David Halberstam, please check it out. It is a terribly interesting book. I'll share with you the thing that I remember the most was a particular piece of data, which McNamara knew all along. I mean, everybody early in both of those administrations knew early on this piece of data. And when I heard it for the first time 3 or 4 years ago, I was just like, wow. And that piece of data was that the North Vietnamese could put on the battlefield every year 200,000 new 18-year-olds, which meant that we were fighting the Vietnamese birth rate. Now, I just can't imagine if that was truly explained to the American public in the 1960s, I think there would have been a bigger revolt than there was. Fighting the birth rate. Basically, they knew we couldn't win ever unless we just completely nuked the country to nothing.
I think that's right. I think that the deeper they would have gotten into what was really happening, clearer they would have become about what the real problem was and what the solution would have been. But sometimes it's hard to admit an error. And that's a hard thing for people to do. And you get yourself publicly committed. And it's hard to back down and back off and say, oops, I'm sorry, I was wrong. In my experience, it's the best strategy is try a lot of things. You think you're well-intentioned. An awful lot of strategy, a lot of business comes as it being emergent. It just serendipitously happens by things you try. Things that you're sure that you plan on are going to work, oftentimes don't in actual combat or actual experience. You have to be very agile and be willing to reconceptualize and admit. So I tried, one of the things I learned as a result of a lot of R&D projects, is try to expense them so you don't get them built up so that when you have to admit defeat or that they don't work, you basically can back away without a lot of public scrutiny and be quick. Try things. They seem to have life and viability. Iterate quickly and often. If they don't, quickly acknowledge defeat, walk away. It isn't the end of the world. It's just a setback. And there's a lot of that in life. Life is lumpy. And there's a lot of that in business. Business is lumpy. There are things that work and things that don't. And you got to be willing to try a lot and be willing to acknowledge them. But you need to be at the grassroots level. You really have to be hands-on. You can't walk away. And you can't fall in love with your plan and your objective. If it's not going to work, it ain't going to work. There was a book written years ago, another teacher. Max Dupree ran Herman Miller, and he wrote a book called The Art of Leadership. He said the real job of a leader is just two things. One is to say thank you, and the second is to define reality. And that struck me. Define reality is easy to say, hard to do. It's not what you want the world to be like. It is not the skills and the sets that you would think you have, but what is it really? What's the competition like? What's the customer like? What are you like? Be real introspective about yourself, honest, brutally honest about your strengths and your weaknesses, and try to match those up. Reality is a hard thing to define, but the best leaders in the world are the ones who most accurately define reality. And that's what you're talking about, Michael. That's the reality, was the 200,000 new recruits every year. That was reality.
Before I bring us back into the timeline, so to speak, of things and get us into the 80s, I want to take a pit stop at donuts themselves and the variety of donuts. I want you to tell me something interesting, provocative, all these different flavors and types. Is there one particular story that jumps out about a style of donut that became a hit and where the idea came from? What are some of those things that, I mean, if this has been your life, it's so damn cool to have a chance to experiment all these flavors and consistencies and what people like and what they don't like. Tell me something about donuts and what people like and what you learned.
You find some of the best ideas come from the people on the front lines, and those are the franchise owners. I know that McDonald's Egg McMuffin was created by a franchise owner in 1972 or 3. I can't remember the exact year. I get a call from an old friend. He was a donut man. He started his life as a donut man in Natick, Massachusetts, our third store. And I actually apprenticed under him as I was learning how to make donuts. His name was Bob Demery. He then went on to buy a couple of stores in Connecticut, stores that I actually had run after college, after hotel school. He called me and he said, I got to tell you something. He said, my wife, Edna, he was in a mixed marriage, a racially mixed marriage. My wife, Edna, has created these donut holes that are phenomenal, and we are knocking the socks off of what's happening. Our business is up 12-20%, and we're selling these donut holes. And I said, donut holes are things that we've been doing forever. We take the centers out of the first cuts of the donuts, and we would wrap them up at Halloween and put them in these little cellophane bags and put them on the countertop in these potato chip clip holders, and we'd sell them around Halloween. He said, no, Bob, you don't understand. He said, Edna created a new die cut for the donut cutter. She's making them bigger. So every munchkin, or the way they didn't call them munchkins in those days, every donut hole was 1/5 of a donut. And she's putting filling in them, and she's frosting them, and she's sugaring them, and honey dipping them, and piling them high in the showcase. And the customers are going crazy over them. So that sounds interesting. We all got in a car, myself, Tom Schwartz, who was the COO of the company, and my close ally in building the business, and Bob Cameron, I think, was heading marketing. We drove down to Hartford, and sure enough, we walk in the store and hear these delightful treats piled high in the store. We knew right then and there, absolutely, Edna had come upon a phenomenal winner. We went back and we went to not to our regular agency, but to an agency that had worked for us temporarily, Hill Holiday, which ultimately became one of New England's largest and among America's largest advertising agencies. Not at the time, they were still young and just starting. It was called Hill Holiday and Cosmopolis, and Steve Cosmopolis was sort of the creative guy of the agency. And he said, let's call them penny poppers. And we thought for that about a week or two and said, as the gas lines are growing, Nixon is inflation growing, he's putting a wage and price control. We can't keep these things at anywhere near pennies. They're going to grow more expensive than that. Can you come up with another name? And they came back and said, every year they run on CBS, I think it is, they run The Wizard of Oz. And they got these little characters in The Wizard of Oz called Munchkins. Let's name it Munchkins. We investigated, and here again, Archie Southgate, the partner from Ropes, who was my board member, he had contacted the company that owned the name, Jack's Cookie Company. I think they're in Louisiana, and they hadn't found a use for Munchkins. So Archie negotiated $1 a year license to take that name, and we developed pots of boxes and buckets. We sold them in 10, 20, and 30 buckets, or you could buy them individually. And in 1972 or 73, again, I can't remember the exact year, we launched Munchkins, and it was a phenomenal success. It speaks just glowingly the need to listen and about the creativity and the impact that your franchise owners as independent businessmen have on the course of the business. And that was another just phenomenal year in our history, despite all the problems occurring in the environment because of that new product. And it's still, this day, it's still a huge winner.
Let me share an experiment with you that I just observed actually today. I took a picture of it. I should send the picture to you on Skype after this. McDonald's only came into Vietnam 5 or 6 years ago. They probably only got about a dozen shops in the country. It's just not been accepted. The food is probably twice as much as a banh mi, and people prefer the banh mi. Maybe they got involved in Vietnam too late for all kinds of reasons, whatnot. Anyways, I walk by in a McDonald's in a mall, one of the few, and I see a big sign, and it says the Vietnamese pho burger. So they've taken the notion of the pho soup and they've created a burger from it. And I said to myself, is that a good experiment or is that a Hail Mary? The idea of that pho soup as a burger. I don't know. We'll have to see, but it's really interesting to watch, to see that firsthand where somebody's trying because they can't get the penetration. They can't get the Vietnamese audience to eat burgers. So they're trying anything they can to get the audience.
My guess is it will be a success. I know of McDonald's opening in India, and I know of Dunkin'. As we go to these different countries, each has different cultural habits. So you can't pick up your American concept and just land and parachute it in and expect it to be successful without modifications to the culture that exists within the country. They will experiment enough with enough products. I think in India, where people don't eat meat, they still have a thriving business. So they've been able to develop a series of products that meet the customer need and is based off of their service delivery system. McDonald's was devised a Henry Ford style production line to deliver sandwiches inexpensively, good tasting, and they will find a way to do that meets the culture, in my view. I think if I had to bet, I'd bet they're going to be successful.
Speak to your forays into international. When did that happen? Where was the first country outside the States where Dunkin' got to?
Well, the first one was Canada. When I got to the company in 68, we already had a store in Sherbrooke, a suburb of Montreal. It was successful. But that was an easy one. That's not far from New England, not far from Boston. As I got there into the business, probably in 64, a year or two after I started, my dad had come to me and said, I understand Mr. Donut's going on a trade mission by the State Department. They're going to Germany and England. And boy, we can't let them beat us. I mean, you can't imagine the pressure that I was under for these donut wars in the early years. It absorbed every element of my waking hour, how we were doing against Mr. Donut. It went so far as the fact that I had to write a book in 1968 called Profits from Franchising to redo the omission that Harry Kirsch had created in his book called The Franchise Boom a few years before, which rightfully placed the creation of this new donut phenomena with my dad as opposed to my uncle. It was top of mind. So I said, yeah, that makes sense to me. So my dad went with the former executive vice president, who was still out of work, and they went to England and in Germany, and they were in all the trade press. They're going to open 400 stores, and I was swept up in that commitment. We opened in England. This guy, I hired him back, the executive vice president, to head up the operations in the UK. He took a fancy office, had a chauffeur. I spent a lot of money. The English hadn't taken to coffee to go in paper cups, and they basically saw it more as a bakery and didn't buy the beverages. It was a tea-drinking country in the early 60s. And a premature introduction. I didn't have the smarts or the strength, width of knowledge to be able to adapt the concept to the country. I was busy doing other things and basically had to close that operation down. But that was my first foray. The second was in 1970, when Mr. Donut again had gone to Japan and had issued a license to a very good company called Duskin that I had a long-term relationship with. We went on a trade mission and we found a large company called Cebu that owned supermarkets and department stores, and they owned an intercontinental hotel chain. And they bought the license for Japan. So in 70 or 71, we launched. While I was doing all these other things, also launching in Japan to beat Mr. Donut. And that was the cry in those early years. That was the motivation. That was what got our juice going, was our competitive battle in the donut wars. It shaped everything we did.
Let me keep you at you for a moment, because going through the book, I mean, in some ways, again, I see a lot of business books, but I love yours because there's so much depth to it, and there's so many ups and downs, and so many different pieces of finance are explored. But how did this all affect you personally, all these roller coasters? Were you always kind of an even keel guy across the many decades of doing this, 35 years? Did it wear on you in ways physically, mentally? I mean, how were you?
As I look back, I don't want to disappoint. I always wanted to please. I wanted to please my dad. I wanted to beat Mr. Donut. I wanted to make him proud of me. I loved what I did. I loved the people I did it with. So I loved my work. I had a real passion for my work. I loved the brand. Early in life, I had major setbacks kids face. I didn't get into the college of my choice. I really wanted to go to Cornell Hotel School, and I didn't get in as a high school. And I had a C in English, and I went to the second best hotel school in those years, Michigan State. And it was the best thing that ever happened to me. I was a straight-A student, president of the largest dorm in the country, Robert Shaw Hall. It all worked out for the best. And I suspect out of those kind of lessons of finding that I always had a second bite or a third bite of the apple, that I became persistent. So I was blessed with the ability, I think through life's happenstances, of being persistent. And the fact that I loved what I did, and I had confidence that ultimately we would find our way. I don't remember being crushed. I was disappointed that I had disappointed, and that saddened me. I had confidence we'd find our way. And I did love what I did. So based on the fact that I had some experience with persistence and the fact that I was buoyed by the comradeship of the team, and it got us through. I'm sure I had low moments, but that's not what sticks out. What sticks out was the lessons learned and the pride I took from that. And the fact is that in my life, no matter what comes, persist, carry on. So long as you have a breath in your body, there's another day. I was watching last night, Gone with the Wind. Tomorrow's another day. That's how the movie ends. Scarlett O'Hara said, well, tomorrow's another day.
Before I take you up to the late 80s and kind of a sail, I want to share, there's a book that I saw a few years back by a professor who recently passed away. You mentioned Malcolm Gladwell. Malcolm Gladwell's 10,000 hours of effort was based on a professor from Florida State named Anders Ericsson. He wrote a book called Peak. It's fabulous, just about deliberate practice. But he did some research about taxi drivers in London. They had to memorize everything. They memorized all those streets.
I know that. I spent a lot of time watching us in England. So.
They looked at the MRIs and they were able to realize that the shape of the brain would change while they were active drivers. And when they weren't active drivers, it would kind of start to shift some. I guess the reason I bring that up is people might not know this right off the bat, but you're not 55. We're talking about a lot of details. I think it probably should be inspiration for folks. I think you're 79, 80, 81. I'm not sure.
82.
82. Okay.
And an active Pilates adherent and try to balance my, but you're onto something.
I'm in Pilates and yoga at 51. So you got 30 years on me. But the reason I bring it up is I wonder, and I'll let you speculate some, the idea of you spending so much time working your mind as a muscle. There's something to this. And I don't think we talk about it enough in society. The idea of how much you work the mind, it does connect with the physical body as well.
I think they both apply. That's my experience is basically you have to have projects that engage. So I'm now in my third career thinking about my fourth major project. And I try to balance my life between physical health. So I spend many hours a week keeping myself physically fit as I can. I try to do some intellectual work, and I spend a lot of time with family, with my grandchildren, traveling with them. It's intention. You've got to be intentioned about it. I don't think there's much question that you will live longer if you keep your body limber and lithe. And I think your mind will stay more active if you keep it engaged. It's another muscle. And I think your whole attitude, you tend not to get old if you basically have things that really excite you and encourage you. My next project after the book is basically it's dusting off an old idea from 1968 after the riots, after the last civil rights and justice issues came to fore, about creating enterprise zones of a bunch of complementary franchise businesses, SBA approval, so much distrust I couldn't launch it. But I'm thinking about starting to do that after I get through my book promotion. I totally support what you're saying, and I find that it was very true in my life. I don't know if I was fortunate because of genetics, but basically I think if you are intentioned and you're planned, I'm taken back to something that I read years ago in a Road Less Travel by, I think it's Scott Peck was the writer. It was a popular book maybe 30 years ago.
Great author, great author.
Laziness is the greatest evil. I think you have to guard against that and having clear plans and being very intentioned about what you want to be and what you want to have. And the 4 or 5 strategic levers you're going to pull to do that apply as much to your personal life as it does to your business life. And I try to do that. I try to be very, very explicit about that, write them down and follow them. You have to be engaged. It just won't happen unless you're intentioned. I'm supporting your position and your observation.
I'm a green tea drinker, unsweetened green tea. So I'm not a coffee guy, but I want to talk coffee for a moment. I was in grad school in London in the early 90s, and there was this nice coffee culture, no Starbucks. And then within 5, 6, 7 years, Starbucks were everywhere. I'm a little bit surprised because I did not realize it seems like, I'm not going to say different audience, but I guess I was a little unaware of how much effort went into Dunkin' Donuts coffee. I mean, it's a tremendous amount of effort, much more low key, at least for my casual observation, much more low key marketing of the coffee than a Starbucks, but obviously a huge loyal following that knows exactly how much effort you guys put into your coffee.
Thank you for observing that. Over the years, it had gone from maybe 40% mix, 35 to 40% mix of sales to today where it's over 60% is beverages. It's primarily a beverage business. And it is a result of a real intense attention to the quality of the product. It starts with the finest beans, the finest roasters, the finest blenders. We grind on premise. We brew so the product is always fresh. We serve with only 18% cream. It's 27 pages of specifications that go into the preparation of a cup of coffee.
Hold on. 27 pages?
Yes, it's a 27-page, at least it was in my day, 27-page specification on coffee. And they haven't changed the formula to this day. They've carried on with the same formula. It's basically American beans. In other words, the beans are grown in Central and South America, roasted in the best roasting houses by great, great coffee blenders to a taste specification, because coffee is an agricultural product. But we're fastidious. I mean, we only use 18% light cream, no ultra pasteurized. Doesn't taste the same to us. I mean, we go through intense care to ensure that that product that gets to the customer is really the best. If you're going to be in this business, you have to have a competitive strategy. And so one of the sustainable strategies for us has always been to have delicious tasting, wonderful products. Coffee is among them, and it keeps growing. And it's a different business than Starbucks. At least it was in my day. Starbucks is a third place where people go to hang out, to work on their computers. It's fancy, different brews. It's different sizes. It's grandes and macchiatos. And Dunkin' is small, medium, large cups. It's basically still a conveniently derived business. More fast food, doesn't have a lot of places to lounge. Today, they're edging into each other's space, but not in my day. I think that there's a reason why the business has been successful is because of the quality of that product.
Let me take you up to the late 80s. Mike Milken, leveraged buyouts, all kinds of stuff. I mean, here you're, again, so many different periods in your career, so many different things to live through and observe. Boy, that whole period, 86, 87, all the leveraged buyouts before Drexel went under, boy, that was a pretty crazy period to be living through as a business owner. There's a whole nother set of risks that you had to manage at that point in time, huh?
That's true. That's true. We were a publicly owned company now. We had gone public in 68, so the 20 years had passed as a publicly owned company. The family had sold a lot of its stock. We didn't control the shares of the company. And in that era, there were people that were green mailers who came in and pushed up stock, bought it, and then got bought back by the company to go away. And there were hostile takeovers. And there was the creation of junk debt, which is brand new, that Milken had identified that the risk wasn't as great as it had originally intended. So they could get confidential letters of confidence that they could finance deals. And there were a group of predators that started in the oil company, Pickens, Boone Pickens, and I guess Icahn. And there were a lot of people that began to start to buy businesses with 5 or 10% of the money at risk, the rest of it through debt, both mezzanine and junk bond financing, taking over companies and pushing out managers. It was so strong in Massachusetts that I was working at the time with Governor Dukakis to start to set legislation that would slow the pace down. Stop and Shop had been put in play. Polaroid had been put in play. Some of the computer companies in the North Shore of Boston, they were put in play. It was just happening everywhere. It was feverish. And they were migrating or being forced in. There was a book called Barbarians at the Gate, the takeover of RJR, a Reynolds Tobacco Company. A lot of the fabled businesses were falling into the hands of financiers, financial engineers. So as a result of that, Goldman Sachs were my lawyers at the time. We had started to get prepared for the possibility of a hostile takeover, and they started to dust off something Polaroid had used called an ESOP, an employee stock ownership program, where I could take 15 or 16% of the shares and place them in the hands of my employees. The management owned about 9 or 10% of the company. That would give us 26%, maybe enough to dissuade a predator. I was hesitant at first because in order to service the debt, I had to create a layoff, and I never had laid off anybody before. I always viewed the staff as family, and this was a hard decision. It was probably the hardest decision I ever had to make, and I postponed it until one of my buddies from business school, who had been a senior manager at Lehman Brothers and started his own boutique firm, finance firm, came in and said, Rosie, that's what he called me. He sat at the edge of my desk. I remember it like yesterday. He said, "You're going to be struck. There are people buying up your stock. You are going to be struck." And that's when I pulled the trigger on the ESOP on the very day that they declared they had a 14D, which meant that they bought more than 5 or 6% of the company. And I was under attack by a financier, real estate guy from Toronto, part of what they call the Bay Street Boys in Toronto, Wheeler and Dealer financial guys. And they were coming after the company. And for the next 7 months, I had to learn a whole brand new set of skills, a new language to try to fend off the hostile takeover. And ultimately, we tried all kinds of ins and outs and machinations and financing kinds of deals. They came with an all-cash offer. Stock had been trading at $20 before they got involved. I think the company sold for $43 a share. It's almost doubled from the time they got involved. And when they made an all-cash, all-shares offer, I had to find a buyer for the business. I decided private equity wasn't going to be the right case because they wanted me to cut more people after the ESOP. So I found at 1 minute to midnight one of our friends, which was a partial supplier, a large company in the UK that had acted as a white knight coming in to save other companies like Hiram Mark in Canada from the Reichmans and their attack, basically to buy the company. The company was auctioned off in 1989, the day after Armistice Day. And luckily, our white knight made the winning bid and bid it away from the predator, who ultimately lost his empire. My guess is, and it's a lot of speculation, but we would have lost Duncan as a business, the brand, the franchisees, all their equity, had he been a successful bidder at the time, because all of his other businesses had gone away.
George Mann was this predator that went down.
Yeah. Yeah, he basically started it with the Union Gas Company in Ontario. And that was fraught with lots of questions about the legality of it. It was under investigation by the Toronto Stock Exchange. And then he went and bought Lincoln Savings in New York. At the end of the 80s, when the real estate crisis occurred and there was a real recession, basically he lost $100 million in the Lincoln Savings thing. That closed down. Then he lost Union Gas. So had he had Duncan in addition, my guess is it would have gone down too. It would have been gone. And I mean, I just hesitate to think what would have happened to all our hard work and to all the investment of all of our thousands of franchisees and their families. Luckily, we found the white knight. We continue to thrive and go from strength to strength in this new environment. But in 1990, a new era had dawned for the company. And I was now no longer had my board and a lot of my management team. We were now a division of a very large international business.
While I've got you, let me shift a little bit to interesting experiences, perhaps interesting sharing experiences, mentor experiences in your position as CEO of Duncan for 35 years. Obviously, you had a chance to become friends with a lot of other CEOs and a lot of other interesting places, interesting businesses, names we all know, more names than we could probably talk about in this conversation. Are there any experiences or pieces of wisdom that you might want to share that came from some of your peers at various CEOs along the way? Is there anything that sticks in mind for you might want to share?
Early on, one of the first decisions I had to make was how we made our money as a company. We started off making our commissions from our franchisees as a result of kickbacks on the sale of different ingredients that they used in the store. And there was some question as to whether or not that was in fact legal or a per se violation of the antitrust laws. I had around 200 shops at the time, and I was attending an International Franchise Association seminar in Lake Arrowhead. And this guy, Keith Roper, how I remember the name is because it was so impactful. He was running United Rentals, and he stood up and he said, "This is how I used to make my money." And I became concerned that it might not be legal. As a result of that, we converted to a straight royalty, which is no question legal. But to do that, you're going to have to sort of come clean with your franchisees and disclose to them how much you're making and promise never to make it ever again in that way. And I came back and asked my cousin at the time, who was CFO, I said, "How much are we making?" He said 5.2% of their sales we're making as our commission from the kickbacks. So we designed a program of 4.5% and vowed never to make any more kickbacks and eliminate all and be totally transparent and buy more efficiently together, as opposed to having us be the middlemen off of non-differentiatable products like shortening and milk and cream and all kinds of things that we were making markups on. Companies that didn't make that transition, this was kind of a life or death decision because it wasn't long before the companies that didn't. For example, the company that Nate Cummings I spoke about earlier had bought Chicken Delight, where they made their money through kickbacks on paper goods and on chickens and things that they sold. They had a treble action lawsuit. They lost, and they lost the company. It closed down. The brand doesn't exist anymore. That was a piece of advice that was extraordinarily useful, and I learned from another CEO at a seminar I attended in 1964, probably in Lake Arrowhead, California.
It's amazing. I mean, so many different things have happened in your career where it was one decision. But I think also, as you talked about, when you're ready, the teacher will come. It's like when you're ready, something will happen that gives you some confidence or some insight to make a new decision. So even though it looks like in hindsight, you had to make it right then and there, maybe you didn't exactly, but it's just amazing. So many parts of your career story are just these pivots. And I just don't, the average person that takes a job and doesn't think about the entrepreneurial mindset, I just don't know if they can relate to that kind of right, left, straight, right, left, straight. I mean, that's your life.
As a leader, you got to make decisions. They coming at you pretty quick. You got to make a decision. And I guess I didn't have a problem making decisions. I made some bad ones. Don't get the wrong impression. I didn't bat 1,000. I mean, Ted Williams only bat 400. I think in order to keep trust, the essence of all relationships, you basically have to keep your major promises. So in my case, if I could deliver 15% or 10 to 15% growth in earnings per share and keep everybody free, never run afoul of the law, provide great products, over time you will build trust with your followership, whether franchisees or employees, and with your bosses, which in my case was my board of directors. But in between that, I was early. If I had a weakness, it's my impatience. When I see a threat looming on the horizon, like Morton's frozen donuts, which was the best new product introduction in decades in the 70s, when Morton's introduced honey dip and jelly donuts in frozen food counters everywhere across the country, I opened a frozen food plant to manufacture donuts frozen because I was concerned. That was a failed decision. I was too impatient. I didn't make the distinction between a fad and a trend. And I've done that on a couple occasions, including fish and chips. You don't bat 1,000. By the same token, you don't stop because of that. You never let the survival of the business be at stake if you can help it. In other words, you never allow the business to get so long. You plant saplings early on to become shade trees later on as you see threats on the horizon. They don't all work out. You can't be put off that people will pick on you or claim that you made this wrong decision or that wrong decision, so long as the major ones and you don't lose the business itself. You live to fight another day. You don't run out of money. You can survive. I don't know if I knew that intuitively. I don't know how that came, but that's basically was sort of my motto.
Let me see if I can read it exactly from your book. I jotted this down. The trick is to edge it out. Don't bet the ranch until you're sure, and don't hesitate to pull the plug if things don't turn out as you hoped.
Absolutely. In a nutshell, that's exactly right. Better said in the book than just now, but absolutely. And life is the same way. It's no different in life as it is in business. All we are is the choices we make about the decisions we face day in and day out. We're making choices all the time. And you're doing that in business as well. You just have to be prepared to make them. And if you make a wrong one, stop it and admit it and move on. But some of them will work out well and some of them won't. That's just the way it comes.
I appreciate you taking the time today. I must share as a kind of a final thought. I thought to myself, and I've been saying this for years, if I could only eat pizza as my only meal and not be dead by age 52, I would probably eat pizza only. But then I was thinking to myself, as I was getting on this conversation with you, hold on, it's more than pizza. It's pizza, it's donuts, and it's bagels. So if I could just eat donuts, I mean, there's been periods of my life where I said, gosh, those bagels I was eating every day were so good. And then one day you look on the scale and you're like, hold on, I got to stop eating bagels every day.
As I would tell my children, I seek the golden mean, moderation in all things, along with the golden rule of treat others as you would want them and treat you as you would want to be treated. I think if you go through life with those two maxims and thoughts, treat others as you want to be treated yourself, and all things in moderation, I think you'll live a pretty good life.
You know, I must say to the audience, too, is that your book is quite detailed. I mean, it's a real tour de force of every last aspect of what's happened across Dunkin'. I mean, just everything we've talked about in very, very granular detail. So people are going to really have to go dive in. To me, you mentioned Barbarians at the Gate. It reads very much like those kinds of stories from the 90s, Barbarians of the Gate, Predator's Ball, it reads like all that kind of detail. So people have enjoyed those books of really knowing how things unfolded and to get all the various lessons. I didn't take you down all the paths that you go down in your book, but you really map out a lot of those great lessons, about the sincerity, the competence, the reliability, caring. All these various issues are so important to your success. So I really highly recommend people checking it out.
Thank you very much, Michael. Appreciate it.
Are you directing anybody to a website or anything, or is it just go find the book?
Yeah. Around the corner to around the world. There's a website that HarperCollins has put up that begins to tease. I think you can get early. The publication date's October 13th, but you can get some early lessons and some other things if you sign up early and pre-order through any Amazon or BAM or Barnes & Noble or a lot of places where it's being distributed. They put up a site. That's where I would recommend people to go.
The book, Around the Corner to Around the World, a dozen lessons I learned running Dunkin' Donuts. Sir, I appreciate you coming on today. I appreciate the energy. I appreciate you going over long with me. And I hope I did not get you bored at any point in time in 90 minutes.
How can you be bored when you're talking about your business and your career? It's so exciting. It's a thrill.
I've got something I tell my audience. I say, when I know I'm going to talk to somebody who's been running a business and they're over age 70, I get excited because usually people they talk. There's no more, gosh, when I talk to young people these days on the podcast, it seems like they're thinking every sentence they say. They just don't flow. They don't let it roll. So when I know somebody's over 70, they've been an entrepreneur, I'm like, oh yes, please. Thank you. I love these conversations.
Yes, sweet. Thank you. I take that as a compliment. Thank you very much. I enjoyed this. I thought it was terrific. I thought the way you brought the questions out, the way you led me was terrific. And you did it in a sequential way and you highlighted some of the things I would have loved to have said. And I'm very appreciative. I think it was great. I really enjoyed it.
Bob, thank you very much. Take care, sir. Have a good one.
You too. Good luck, Michael.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, Trend Following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.